Program was provided by Friends of Iowa Public Television and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Askew, Cranston, Glenn, Hart, Hollings, Jackson, McGovern, Mondale. They met today at the Des Moines, Iowa Civic Center for the Iowa Democratic Debate.
Hello, I'm Dean Borg. In moments, you'll see one of the major events of the 1984 presidential campaign, a debate among the 8 candidates seeking the Democratic nomination for president. It comes just 9 days before the Iowa precinct caucuses, considered the first important electoral test of the campaign year, against a background of foreign events that already this week has changed the nature of the race for the White House. The debate, recorded earlier today, is sponsored by the Des Moines Register. The moderator is the editor of that newspaper, James Gannon.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Iowa Democratic Debate, sponsored by the Des Moines Register. I'm James P. Gannon, editor of the Register, and I'll be the moderator of today's debate. 9 days from today, Iowa Democrats will gather in 2,500 precinct meetings across the state to begin the process of selecting the 1984 Democratic nominee for president. The 8 Democrats competing for support in Iowa are here with us today to discuss the issues of the 1984 campaign. Gentlemen, welcome to Iowa. The participants in our The participants in our debate today are Ernest Hollings, George McGovern, John Glenn, Alan Cranston, Jesse Jackson, Walter Mondale, Gary Hart, and Reuben Askew. I appreciate your enthusiasm. I also would appreciate it if you'd try to restrain it so that we can hear each other here and get on with the program. We'll begin with brief opening remarks from each of the candidates, beginning with Mr. Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Gannon. This election is indeed important, not just to us as candidates, but for our party and for our nation. The events of the past 48 hours, however, make us pause and reflect on the very fragile and the grave state of world affairs. The leader of the Soviet Union is dead. Our president has never met with him, spoken to him, shaken his hand, or looked him in the eye. Relations with Russia have only rarely been as bad as they are now. In Lebanon, we find ourselves in an undeclared war with an unknown enemy. The war grows wider, the stakes grow higher. I opposed sending the Marines to Lebanon in the first place. But once there, I argued strongly that their mission should be secure and should be better defined. But such is not the case. What the president is doing in Lebanon is involving us in a civil war that's wrong, it's flat wrong. It's worse than that, it's irresponsible, and it's a moral outrage. The president is playing politics as he tries to save face and protect a bankrupt foreign policy. Just last Tuesday, the president led the American people to believe that he is withdrawing our Marines immediately. In fact, he is not. We're now told that redeployment might take many months, even though it could be done in just a matter of hours. In the meantime, the president has ordered naval bombardment of Beirut, and those 16-inch shells are tearing into villages, killing women and children, while our Marines are kept in place to become even more the targets for fanatical retribution. There's little military justification for what the president is doing and no moral justification whatsoever. Because of our steadily deteriorating relationship with the Soviets and because of our ill-conceived and morally outrageous position in Lebanon, we need new leadership both at home and in the world. Together we can make a difference.
Thank you,
and
Senator
together
Glenn.
we can make a more sane, sensible, and secure future for ourselves and for our children.
Thank you, Senator Glenn. Our next opening remark will be from Senator Hollings.
Well, I too believe in the importance of our foreign policy. We Democrats have always been strong with respect to building up a world around respect for the values that we hold dear. Specifically with respect to the Marines, over a year ago, prior to their deployment. I said if they were put there to fight, there were too few. If they were put there to die, there were far too many. But I think the target really is Ronald Reagan. And I'm looking at the fact that we've lost the last 3 out of 4 races as Democrats because we'll come here in the next 2.5 hours and we'll promise you literally everything. We will give you a program for the retirees, the senior citizens, the pensioners, and everybody else. But we'll never talk about paying for it. We'll get lockjaw. And unless we can prove our reliability as being able to manage that economy, we're not going to get rid of Ronald Reagan out of that White House. I have accordingly submitted the freeze proposal, where we'd take just last year's budget. People say, how are you going to do that politically? Last year, through 3 readings in the House, 3 readings in the Senate, signed by the President just in November. I'm saying take that budget, not only just politically attain, but extend it for 1 year. We would immediately pick up $100 billion, and then we would be able to get down the value of the dollar. Then Iowa farmers would be able to sell their products without that 32% tax or penalty due to the overvalued dollar. Then industry would be able to invest and reemploy. Then we would be able to get our country moving again. And finally, then we would be able to pay for the programs. But we Democrats are going to talk for 2.5 hours and not mention anything realistic like that. We're going to say, I am concerned. Any question y'all going to ask, we are concerned, but we're not going to pay for it.
Our next is Senator Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Gannon. I want to take this occasion to thank the people of Iowa for their hospitality and kindness to Lee and myself throughout the course of the last year. We appreciate it very much. I'm a Democrat, and I'm proud of it. But this election this year is not just between the Democrats and the Republicans, or just between liberals and conservatives. It's between our future and our past. I believe the new leadership this country is asking for is different in several ways. First, that new leadership believes in solving problems and not just debating old ideologies. Nowhere is this clearer than on the issue of defense and national security. Ronald Reagan clearly wants to give not only a blank check, but a blank checkbook to the Pentagon to prosecute and increase Cold War. Others in our party want to cut our national defenses almost arbitrarily, regardless of the consequences. I believe that this country needs a strong national defense by reforming our conventional forces to make them the most effective and not just the most expensive. Second, the new leadership of this country believes in innovation, not just supporting old programs, but doing what Franklin Roosevelt advised, and that is bold, persistent experimentation. Why not individual training accounts to protect the jobs of our working Americans? Why not a freeze on the production of plutonium used to make nuclear weapons? Why not a tiered price support system to save the family farmer in this country? Third, I think the new leadership the American people want puts principle above politics. Nowhere is that clearer than on the issue of Lebanon. There are some candidates for this highest office of this land that delayed in terms of coming out to bring the Marines out. Others on Capitol Hill held back in an effort to achieve some political advantage. I think if all of us had joined together, all of us on this platform, to pull the Marines out as I recommended in September of 1982, possibly 300 would be alive today, and that's the kind of bold leadership I think this country needs.
Thank you, Senator Hart. Our next speaker is Reverend Jackson.
Today I've come to learn and to share and to participate and debate the great moral imperatives of our day, to feed the hungry and to end war. I'm not a farmer, but I'm concerned. We have the options of mutual development and mutual annihilation in this world. We'll either freeze the weapons or we will burn the people and freeze the planet. Today we're witnessing the most severe farm crisis since the Depression, but there's a parallel urban crisis. Record foreclosures on family farms wrecked. The rate is 3 times higher for blacks. 6 million farmers in 1945, about 2.3 million today. Our food, water, and air is poisoned, a kind of self-imposed chemical warfare, a rise in the misery and the danger index. a crisis in industrial integrity. The #1 agricultural system in the world, and yet 20 million people malnourished in this country, a half billion in the world. Just over in Kansas City, there's $6 billion worth of food stored, the cost of $383 million a year, more than $1 million a day to store food while people are starving. The response to PIC program for the rich, pickpocket program for the poor, $2 billion cut in food stamps, 4 million more people out of welfare, out of food stamps, or out of options. We need leadership. We must move from nuclear threat with Russia to some form of mutual survival. We need not compete on overkill, but now compete with agriculture and trade and technology. We need to restructure agricultural relations. The Ag Department must function for the poor and the family farmer. We must convene the leaders of the world, not just to end nuclear confrontation, to use this vast resource to feed this world and to end tension. We need to put food above politics. We need more than a new president. We need a new direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. We now go to Senator Cranston.
What we must do in this debate is set the agenda that will defeat Ronald Reagan. We failed to do that in 1980, and he beat us. Ronald Reagan has taken us to tragedy in Lebanon, to the invasion of Grenada, and to the brink of war in Central America. He's given us $1 trillion deficit, and he's thrown 5 million of us out of work. But if we're going to win this time, the Democratic Party must realize that the American people want a president with a clear vision of where he will lead America. We need a democratic vision that revives the work ethic in America, that says people who work should be able to earn a good living, that commits us to preserve the small American businessman and woman and the family farm as a way of life in our country. The democratic vision must lead the way to peace. We must have the guts not to use guns just because we got bigger and better guns than the other guy. We must see to it that America helps feed a starving world and shines again as the beacon of freedom and justice. This clear democratic commitment to peace and jobs must be at the center of our vision. We must give America leadership that will make us respected but not feared again in the world. That vision, that clear vision, will beat Ronald Reagan in 1984. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cranston. Mr. McGovern.
On October 8th, I opened my campaign here in Iowa with a statement of 10 steps that I would take as President of the United States. I would like to restate those steps today. First of all, terminate right now all U.S. military operations in Central America. We must stop embracing and arming these miserable military dictators who caused revolution in Central America in the first place. Secondly, bring our Marines home from Lebanon right now. Why this further delay, and why the shelling of Lebanese Muslims and Druze with whom we have absolutely no real quarrel? So let's put the Marines on the ships today and start those ships back to the USA. How about that poem, Jesse? Fourth, with enough weapons already to utterly destroy the world many times over, let's invoke the nuclear freeze right now and then go after the enormous waste in the Pentagon procurement of weapons, other boondoggles in that system. If we would do that, we could save 25% in President Reagan's current military budget. And Fritz, that's the way to pay for these programs that you say people aren't thinking about. Fifth, let's stop paying farmers $12 billion a year not to produce, guarantee them a decent parity program, and then use the surplus to end hunger in this country and around the world. The remaining steps I'll get to after I get to the White House.
Mr. Mondale.
On February 20th, the voters of Iowa, the Democrats, will be the most powerful citizens on earth. Mr. Reagan has announced that he's coming to Des Moines that night, and I hope that you'll all send him a very strong message while he's here. There are three fundamental objectives that must be achieved by the next president, and all of them require the defeat of Mr. Reagan. The first is to elect a president who will use America's strength to lead this world toward safety. This president has led us in a way that the world is now as dangerous as it's ever been before in the history of the world. No arms control talks, an arms race instead. The tragedy, the bloodshed in the Middle East, in Central America, and all the rest. His leadership has made the world much more dangerous, and we cannot tolerate it. Secondly, his leadership has resulted in the absolute deterioration of America's posture in international competition. We are now in full and utter retreat. This will be the worst trade year in American history by all odds. Some 4 million Americans have lost their jobs. It has been the worst thing ever happened to the American farmer, and he's providing no leadership to restore competitiveness or to train the next generation. The third objective must be the restoration of a fair nation. In a radical way, this president is trying to teach us to disregard our fundamental sense of fairness. And the average American family, in every conceivable way, has been asked to bear the full burden of these unfair and uncaring policies. We must beat Mr. Reagan. I'm convinced I can do it.
Thank you, Mr. Mondale. We will complete this round of opening statements with Mr. Askew.
It's no accident that Ronald Reagan is in the White House, and he'll stay there unless we Democrats have the political will to be candid with the American people. Our party has lost touch with the mainstream, the middle class, the working people, small business, and with the forgotten majority of the American people. And now we're allowing a few within our party to dictate the choice of our nominee for president. I'm the different Democrat. I'm reaching beyond those few to speak for the forgotten majority. I speak for those who want America to live within its means. I speak for those who want both a strong defense and arms reductions. I speak for those who want jobs and profits and opportunity in a competitive economy that doesn't have to rely on domestic content or other forms of undue protection. I speak for those who value both the potential of life before birth and after birth. And I speak for those who want a president who's willing to be different, who's willing to risk losing some votes so that you can get there the right way, so that you can govern on behalf of all the people. I speak for those who are looking for real leadership that can deal realistically in the real world.
Thank you, Mr. Askew. For the next hour, the candidates are going to question one another. Prior to the debate, each candidate drew the names of 3 others and prepared questions for those 3 candidates. I will call the order of this questioning as determined by those drawings. I remind the candidates that the questions should be brief and to the point. No speeches, please. Answers will be limited to 2 minutes. The first question from Mr. Glenn is for Mr. Cranston.
Alan, there are those who are trying to make our vote on the August 1981 tax bill a litmus test as to whether or not we are real Democrats. We lost the White House and the Senate back in those days. Do you feel less a Democrat for supporting a change in the nation's economic policy at that time?
No, but frankly, I wasn't seeking the change that we got. I voted against Kemp Roth every time we had a vote on that, 12 times. I voted for the final passage of the bill that had Kemp Roth in it. We couldn't defeat it because it had some good measures in it, like reducing the marriage penalty, like IRAs. There were some good things that I thought outweighed the bad. As it turned out, the deficit got totally out of hand because of that tax cut, along with the huge increase in military expenditures, and I now think that tax cut was that vote was a mistake. But what we've got to do is look to the future. What do we do about what Reaganomics turned out to be? And I think what we must do is restore taxes on well-to-do people not now paying their fair share. I think we should close loopholes like the loophole that permits people to have a tax shelter by buying a farm and then not farming. We should get Americans back to work so they're paying taxes and don't need entitlements and don't need assistance. Thus revenues go up and expenditures go down. That's the way to cut entitlements. Not cut out what people need, but cut out what they don't need when they're back at work. That's the way to save there. Get down interest rates. If we cut interest rates from 12% to 6%, we'd knock $50 billion off the deficit. Finally, get the arms race off our backs. Ronald Reagan wants to spend $2 trillion in the next 5 years on military matters. I don't believe we can do that and balance the budget anytime soon, and I don't believe we need to do that to protect ourselves. We are the strongest nation on earth now. We don't need to squander our money in the arms race when it deprives us of what we need for domestic needs.
Our next question will be from Mr. Jackson for Senator Hollings.
Senator Hollings, in these debates, there's an awful lot of focus on what the government can do, cannot do, should and should not do. At best, we're talking about a $900 billion, $930 billion public economy. It's a $3 trillion private economy. Almost no focus on corporate accountability or industrial integrity. They take our tax dollars and close plants on workers without notice, or they replace robot with robot and make us feel guilty about losing our jobs on the one hand, or they engage in chemical warfare upon the American people. Acid in the rain, dioxin in the earth, contaminate our water and our streams. If you were president, what would you do to demand industrial integrity and accountability?
Right to the point, Jesse. I think the first thing to do is try and answer your question on the environmental end. Of course, I have the bill in with Senator Mitchell relative to acid rain. With respect to the industrial integrity about robots, we are moving to a technological age. We're not going to stop that technological development because we are competing in an international economy, and every one of these great modern industries right here in Iowa know that. But what we realize is that we're competing with those pay scales offshore. We need a trade council, just like we have a national security council, to correlate our trade effort and give us a fair chance to compete. Someone mentioned Roosevelt. In order to keep the banks open, he closed the doors. In order to save the farms, he plowed under the crops. And in order here to remove a barrier, we might have to raise a barrier to give our steel and basic industries a chance to compete. But the real bottom line of it all is about those closing of plants, we causing it. This crowd right here in Washington, we babble along on $200 billion deficits as far as the eye can see. Worse than an arms race, we got a spending race going on between Republicans and Democrats. Ronald Reagan doesn't want to do anything about it. He's asked for another $100 billion increase in the budget he submitted last week. The Democrats are dancing around the fire. But if we could just get a hold of ourselves, we can get that White House back. And the way to do it is just reenact last year's budget where no one would really suffer. It would be a shared sacrifice. Then they'd quit closing, talking about corporate integrity, get back to political integrity. Then they'd stop closing those plants down, re-employing, and the recovery would be complete rather than tapering back at the present time.
Thank you, Senator. Our next question will be from Mr. Askew for Reverend Jackson.
Reverend Jackson, I noticed in one of our last appearances you had indicated what I thought possibly was a different position that you might have taken in the past on abortion. I guess one of the reasons that I'm different on it is that I do favor a constitutional amendment to reverse Roe v. Wade in order to let Congress set a national standard What is your position on that right now, sir?
My position is I am not pro-abortion, I'm freedom of choice. Even as a matter
I remind the audience that you're using up Jesse Jackson's time.
even theologically, God gives us choice. We must live with the consequences of that choice, whether we go to heaven or hell, but at least we are not robots, we're people, we have choice. Within the law, we have the choice. I would never encourage abortion. I do not embrace it. I put more focus on sex education before the fact and self-discipline before the fact, that people might be responsible and disciplined and matured and make decisions the day before so they will not make decisions the day after. The fact is, it is one's choice, and it is also one's consequences that must be lived with. That is, it's for me, it's a matter of fear and trembling was the position I take, and I stand with that position.
Thank you. Our next question will come from Senator McGovern to Mr. Askew.
Reuben, I understand that you've been cultivating the support of the so-called Right to Life movement, while at the same time opposing the nuclear freeze. Now, in view of the fact we already have enough weapons to utterly kill everybody on Earth without building any more, wouldn't you make a great contribution to the right to life if you came out for the nuclear freeze?
I would, Senator, if I thought it was the surest path to peace. I don't believe that the nuclear freeze goes far enough. I think you literally need to put caps on the number of warheads we have, caps on the number of missiles, caps on the overall destructive capability, more like a frost than a freeze, something that covers everything, puts a lid on it, but doesn't freeze in our inability to be able to selectively modernize to ensure a strong deterrent, and then to build down, taking away those a certain amount, whatever the formula might be, for each ones we employ, and then in the process negotiate much more seriously. You and I both know that up until the build down, which was a result of a nonpartisan, bipartisan consensus, not consensus, but people in the Senate, what we were talking about was giving them proposals knowing they wouldn't accept them giving us proposals knowing we wouldn't accept them. And all during the time, the third world, and we have the nuclear proliferation that I think that Senator Glenn has been a leader in this area. That's the great danger right now, that the third world is going to get in possession of it and set off something none of us can stop. Because there's no such thing as a limited nuclear war once it starts. But please understand that I am as committed as you are towards saving this planet, but I'm also fully cognizant that we've denied 15 million children a chance to have life during this period since Roe v. Wade. I'm concerned both ways, sir.
Now, Senator Cranston has a question for Mr. McGovern.
George, you're the only one of us up here who has been the Democratic standard bearer for president in a presidential campaign. What lessons did you learn from that experience that will help us beat Ronald Reagan, because that's what we got to do?
Well, I think the first lesson I learned about this, Alan, I want to win as badly as you do, but I learned in 1972 there are some things that can happen to you in politics that are even worse than losing an election. I wouldn't change places with the man who won in 1972. Now, having said that, let me give all of you a little practical advice. Work hard, but don't work so hard you get fatigued to the point where your judgment becomes clouded. Most of the mistakes that are made in presidential campaigns are made because of fatigue. So don't work so hard trying to catch up with me that that you wear yourselves out. Now, one final serious note to all of us. Let's try to stay with what we really believe. Let's not watch those changing and unpredictable public opinion polls too much. Let's lay out the weaknesses of the present administration as clearly as we can. Instead of worrying too much about knocking each other over the head, let's lay bare the malfunctions, the weaknesses of this present administration, and then lay out as clear an alternative agenda as we can of what we as Democrats stand for and what we propose to do in terms of the directions of the country.
Senator Hart, now it's your turn to direct a question to Senator Glenn.
Well, I first of all want to thank George for not mentioning his campaign manager.
Did it have one?
Senator Glenn, you unfortunately were not able to join with us in the farm debate we had here a few weeks ago, and so the people didn't get a chance to get your views on agriculture. You and Fritz Mondale disagree on a lot of things. One thing you do agree on is the domestic content bill. Would you care to state why you think that will not severely impact Iowa's farmers and farm implement industries?
Sure. I was sorry I could not be at that, as a matter of fact. I had other commitments in Florida at that time. They'd been on for a long time, and I was sorry I could not join you for that forum. But as far as domestic content goes, there are two functions on domestic content. One is making trade fair. And right now we're not being dealt with fairly in that trade area. I come from a farming state also, Ohio. It has major industrial interests also. But in the area of affecting farmers, I don't feel it does affect farmers, because while we make it fair, we're also keeping our defense industry up, and that's important to keep our steel industry above that 28% that it was down to just about a year and 2 months ago. And that was one of the main reasons for voting for that local content, was to avoid a government subsidy to our steel industry. But the main thing with farming is to make sure that we have it as fair as we can possibly make it. The 4 points I've been making on agriculture have been that we want to expand those markets. That means indeed getting control of the deficit, so we do not have the huge interest rates we have that cut our farm marketing down. About 1/3 of our farm produce normally goes overseas. We have seen that reduced by about 1/4 over the last 2 years, mainly because of the rise in interest rates. The dollar too strong, distorted against other currencies. We also want to make certain that we have our marketing stable here at within our own country here. Set-aside programs, acreage reduction programs. First, we should have gone into this thing with the idea of saving some of the family farms that the administration indeed did have legislation and the authority to take on, such as the $600 million loan program for economic disaster that on the farms that the president had to be literally taken to court to make him use some of that authority. Third area is conservation. We have some 140 million acres at danger right now. And number 4 is to preserve that family farm, not only with emergency help, but also with the programs that will keep stability on the farm and increase those markets all around the world.
Your time is up. We go now to Mr. Mondale, who will have a question for Senator Hart.
Senator, one of the most important objectives, in my opinion, toward the future of our economy is to get labor and management and government working together, cooperating and not fighting for the long-term interests of the industry and the country. That's what I did, helped do in the Chrysler loan, where we got everyone together, saved 600,000 jobs, and finally actually made some money for the American taxpayer, and we have a healthier industry. You oppose that. What is your view now?
My view is that that was not good industrial policy, and I would have supported a similar measure if it had encompassed the entire American automobile industry. Indeed, that agreement is the pattern by which I think we ought to negotiate agreements among management, labor, and private capital, not public spending, to direct investment into modernization of plant and equipment and training of our workers, so that by the end of the 1980s, this country does not have Japanese-owned automobile industries or West German-owned automobile companies, but American-owned automobile companies producing autos, steel, machine tools as efficiently and productively as any nation on earth. I don't believe the government ought to go around bailing out individual companies. I do think in the 1980s, to make this country competitive, we are going to have a Democratic president who resists the temptation of protectionist legislation that'll be so destructive to this state and to our nation's economy, but does bring the players together in the private sector to form an agreement by which, within a specified period of time, not just Chrysler, but every viable American automobile manufacturer is producing cars in competition with those that are the best in the world. And that is exactly what my policy as president will be.
Now, Senator Hollings, you have a question for Mr. Mondale.
Fritz, I really believe if we as Democrats could lead the way for sacrifice as John Kennedy did, we could win that White House back. But instead of the sacrifice, you're promising by the end of your term a $100 billion deficit. Why don't we pay for our future and quit wrecking our children's future? Can't we do better than that?
As a matter of fact, I think the objective of reducing the federal debt is the most single important domestic objective that must be achieved. There's no alternative. If in my presidency I don't get that deficit down by more than half, as I promised, it will just not only destroy my presidency, but destroy the hope for restored competitiveness, for reduced interest rates, for full employment. And that is why I have proposed a specific proposal, the most specific of all the candidates, for reducing the president's deficits by more than half. This involves cutting defense spending and defense waste. It involves a national health care cost containment program. It involves wise management of the agricultural program. It involves the reduction of interest rates through reduced deficits. And it involves other efforts to get the spending down by over $70 billion. That's my commitment. Then we have to restore revenues. And I'm committed to restore revenues by at least $60 billion, but to do so in a progressive way where people of that average income that have gotten hit so hard by the Reagan tax programs doesn't get hit again, as some here are proposing, but instead by increasing taxes on higher income Americans, by plugging loopholes, by enforcing laws against tax evaders, and the rest, restore at least $60 billion in revenue. We also have to be realistic. There are certain new expenditures that are needed. Pro-competitive expenditures. We simply must invest in this new generation for education and science and technology. We have a deteriorating infrastructure, and there's some very compelling needs for fairness. But I have defined exactly how I'm going to do it, the dollars within which I'm going to achieve those objectives, and all of it is consistent with reducing those deficits. It simply must be done.
Now that completes our first round of questions among the candidates. We're going to begin a second round now with a question from Mr. McGovern to Senator Cranston.
Alan, you've been one of the nation's leaders in the efforts to reduce the danger of nuclear war. Considering the fact that the United States is the only country that has ever used nuclear weapons against another country, which I think places a special moral challenge on us, would you favor our party going on record at our convention next summer with a recommendation that the United States commit itself never again to being the first country to use nuclear weapons? In other words, the no first strike pledge.
George, I believe that should be the objective of the next president, and it should be in our party platform. We do have to do it in consultation with our allies. We sold them on this policy of our putting nuclear missiles in Europe. I oppose the new additions, the Pershings and the Cruises. We have to make plain to them that we will revise our force structures and revise the places where we have our strengths so that we will not ever be tempted to make a first use. If we just say we're not going to use them first, the Russians won't believe us. They've said they're not going to use them first, and we don't really believe them. They haven't made changes in their force structure and in their positioning of their strength to convince us that that is their policy. That is what we must do. But I'm all for it, and I would do all that I can, and I will do what I can to see it's in the platform, and I trust that the next president will move in that direction so that that can be our policy, and that beyond that, of course, our objective is not only never to use them first, but never to use them second, third, fourth, or last. We have to abolish these weapons from the face of the earth.
Senator Hart now has a question for Mr. Mondale.
Mr. Vice President, several of us here have given much of our political lives of various durations to the interests of working men and women. You, of course, were fortunate enough to get the endorsement of organized labor in your campaign, and the president of the AFL-CIO said the decision was based upon the fact that you had never disagreed with labor on one issue. Can you cite one major domestic issue in the last 3 or 4 years where you have disagreed with AFL-CIO or organized labor?
As a matter of fact, they came to me in support of my proposals, in support of my budget, in support of my objectives for this country. This was not a case of a deal, of me agreeing to do something with them. And that's why they came to my cause. They trust me. Moreover, they've got a reason to be involved in this campaign. In the modern history of American politics, we have never had a president that has assaulted the interests of working men and women like this administration, whether it's taxes or health costs or soaring interest charges or hostility to labor or job safety or Social Security, any of the things that ought to be essential and a part of the bargain of working men and women. This administration has just gone out of its way to assault that average working family. And they are coming to me in my support because they want a candidate who they can trust, not who they can run. I'm my own person. I'm not running for president of the AFL-CIO. I'm running for president of the United States. And I've told them, as I've told everyone else, you're going to have to give things to the betterment of this country. And they're prepared to do it. But they have a right, the working men of this country, to get a president of the United States who understands that it's his responsibility to stand up for the needs of average working Americans. We need that desperately, and that's what I'm going to do.
Now, Mr. Askew, it is your turn to ask a question of Senator Hart.
Senator Hart, you have criticized Fritz Mondale for not having the courage to take a firm stand early on difficult issues, and I certainly agree with you, and I didn't quite hear his answer to your last question. But haven't you done the same thing on domestic content? I came out strongly against the bill. You said you once might vote for it, but you didn't seem to have the courage to come out against it until it became obvious you couldn't get the endorsement of the labor unions. Is that correct?
No, Governor, that's not correct, and you know it's not. What I said was that I would support the domestic content legislation if that were the only way to save the American automobile industry. I take it your position is, even if that were the only way to save it, you wouldn't support it and you would let the American automobile industry go down the tubes. I am not willing to take that position, no. I sent the head of the UAW in this state a letter almost a year ago in which I laid out my position on domestic content very clearly, and I've shown you that letter. And I said in that letter that I did not intend to support domestic content because there was a better way to save the American automobile industry, and it was just exactly what I've said, not by bailing.
Reverend Jackson, on last evening I noted that you had first been able to visit Iowa since you had announced, and I know you haven't had the opportunity to really express, as some of us have, the views that you would want known as president. As president of the United States, what would be your first 3 priorities?
Peace, justice, and education, and in that order. A, because the nuclear buildup is so costly and so dangerous and so likely to take place, it must be the first order of business. Whoever the next leader is of the Soviet Union, our president must take the initiative to meet with that leader. We must have the inner security, because we do have the military security, to meet unconditionally, but agree conditionally. We must lead by leadership initiative. The present danger is that you could have a nuclear war either by margin of human error or computer malfunction. Since they have first-rate nuclear power, but third-level computers, we could be victimized by their own inefficiency. Thirdly, we could be trapped by an unauthorized agent or zealot pushing the wrong button. Peace is a very critical issue in my judgment. In such a meeting, if we move from nuclear defense as the way of measuring who we are to economic offense, begin to relate on agriculture and trade and technology, we increase relations and we reduce tension. To that end, while we're looking at East-West, there is a North-South conflict. Our boys dying in Honduras, having died in Grenada, dying in Lebanon, we simply need to have a peace policy as opposed to a war policy. It's a more civilized way to go. Secondly, within our nation, there must be a sense of justice. This idea within our party about long shots and big shots. Hard for a long shot to win. There's something dishonest about that. If it's there one person, one vote, why should it be long shots? If you're a Southerner, that's long shot. The way you talk makes you a long shot. If you're black, Hispanic, female, disabled, poor, or young, so if the majority is the long shot, why should the big shots have an aristocratic domination over us? Thirdly, the idea of education. Our first line of defense is not guided missiles, it's developed minds. We must educate our children. We must educate our children.
Time's up. Now, next, Senator Cranston has a question for Senator Hollings.
Fritz, I've been thinking about a dream ticket. Cranston, Hollings.
There you go, you got it.
I think we could just blow Reagan Bush out of the water with my Hollywood good looks and your clear Eastern accent. But first I got a question. You serve in the Senate Budget Committee. You've been wrestling with these $200 billion deficits that can add up to $1 trillion. What will those deficits do to our country, to our society, if we don't stop Ronald Reagan?
It mortgages our future. It puts our children into a tremendous gridlock whereby there's just no way other than to come and pay for the interest cost on the national debt, a little bit for defense and Social Security, and that's all. We'd be muddling along like England. They will not be able to afford a home. They'll not be able to send their children to college. Now, immediately at this moment, these deficits have gotten us in penalty position with respect to international trade, with respect to jobs, industry expanding and re-employing. But to come down the pike, as you indicate, and just mortgaging our future here, we're drunk on the tracks out there with Reaganomics recovery, and this deficit train is rushing down on us, and it's going to knock us in to that kind of gridlock where our children will never be able to get anything done. It'll make us a second-rate nation. And I'm more concerned that we do something about it, because it's seemingly now we're all pollster politicians. I am concerned, those pollster fellas, that poor Gary Hart was locked up with 2 hours with Pat Goodale coming all the way over here from Omaha. That's bad enough. They never have solved any problem. They'll tell you not to solve a problem, Alan. That's exactly what they'll do. Just say you're concerned, hit and run driving, and that's the way to get reelected. And I rather believe in the way Kennedy approached the thing and lead the way for sacrifice. If we can all just hold the line for 1 year and then have 3% real growth, we can work our way out of this situation. But it's going to take that kind of sacrifice with respect to the economy, that kind of balance with respect to the military that you and I both understand. And unless we approach it in that fashion, we're going to be a second-rate nation.
Mr. Jackson, it's now your turn to ask Senator Glenn.
Senator Glenn, part of our strength, and I believe in a strong military defense, but history teaches us that ultimately might is not right, right is might. And part of what makes our nation strong is its commitment to democratic principles. One person, one vote. We finally got to that. We measure one person, one vote. Majority rule is democracy in this country. South Africa, minority rule represents democracy. Our nation now is South Africa's #1 trading partner. help get them an IMF loan to make them stronger. What would you do to salvage us of this position of a moral disgrace, being the #1 trading partner? How would you end that relationship, put pressure on apartheid, and would you serve on the board of a corporation that was in fact doing business with the government of South Africa?
Well, we all abhor completely the apartheid policies of the government of South Africa. And I think this administration, with their constructive agreement, as they tried to call it, that they were going to somehow lead the South Africans into, well, they would not be against apartheid too much, and that way they would try and work with them and try and get some sort of arrangement with them, just did not work in any way. In fact, it was our own government that suggested that perhaps the Cubans in Angola gave them an excuse for going into Namibia. And so they've been into Namibia for all these years. And we should not have done that. I would discourage investment in South Africa. I would not say that we would prohibit it absolutely and completely, because we have some American firms there that might wish, in fact, to make more investment in expanding their policies where they actually have blacks in management positions over white South Africans. And there are some of those companies there, but I would not prohibit completely, but I would say that we would discourage any new investment in South Africa, certainly. And one of the other areas that I'm particularly concerned with South Africa is I was the principal author of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act of 1978. We've tried to work very closely with South Africa in getting them to agree that they will not develop nuclear weaponry. We have not been able to do that with them. This administration, in fact, just approved some new parts sales and things to the government of South Africa, which encourages them toward the development of nuclear weapons, and I would not want to see that continue. I would enforce that Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act just as carefully as we possibly can, not only there, but all over the world. So I would discourage it. I would discourage investment in South Africa. I would hold out the hope that if it did not move, they don't move off the black spot policy and the policies they've had there, we might make a cutoff at some time in the future. But right now, I would discourage investment in South Africa.
Would you serve on the board of a corporation doing business with that government?
Very quickly.
Depend on the company.
It's now Vice President Mondale's turn to ask a question of Mr. McGovern.
George, the Secretary General and the President of the Soviet Union has died. There's a funeral about to take place, and I recommended, I think you did too, that the President go there, not so much to negotiate, but to signal his desire to end this escalating tension and arms race and make a new beginning. Would you agree with that, and what other steps would you take to try to move past this ever more dangerous environment that threatens civilization?
Yes, I do indeed agree with the idea that it would have been a dramatic opportunity for the President to signal that we're turning over a new leaf in our relations with the Soviet Union. It's a modern tragedy that this man, Andropov, came to power, served his time, and died, and never once even saw the head of the other superpower. I think every president since World War II, without exception, has come to the view, some of them late in their administrations, that notwithstanding our painful differences with the Soviet Union, we have to talk with the leadership of that country. As President Eisenhower puts it, there's no alternative to coexistence except no existence. Now, here was an opportunity with the death of the Soviet leader for the President to send a clear message to the people of that country, and also perhaps to confer with the next leader of the Soviet Union on the problems that we need to be exploring to head off the danger of nuclear disaster. There ought to be regular meetings between the heads of state. There ought to be meetings and exchanges between people at the scientific level. We ought to push that as vigorously as we can. People in the cultural areas, the educational areas, farmers, workers, industrialists, so that we minimize the danger of misunderstanding. I think if nuclear war comes, it'll come not because either side wants it, but because of a breakdown in communications, the fact that we're literally scaring each other to death today. We all say we're doing this in the name of defense. while building for war. The time has come to begin talking and negotiating.
Thanks, Senator. We're now ready to begin our third and final round of the questions among the candidates. We will begin with Mr. Askew, who has a question for Mr. Mondale.
Fritz, in 1981, after you left the vice presidency, you said you fully supported decontrol of gas prices. Now you say you'll halt the rising cost of natural gas. What is your real position, and does it relate to your paid lobbying for a law that could make consumers upfront pay for additions to a multi-million-dollar pipeline to Alaska that'll never be finished? And how does it relate to the fact that the builder of that pipeline gave thousands of dollars to you in your personal PAC?
Well, first of all, Mr. Askew, my position on that issue is very clear. I have always been against the deregulation of oil gas. I have always been for the repeal of the take-or-pay contracts. The pre-billing issue that you're talking about, I was always opposed to that. I never did any lobbying on that. I wasn't involved in that issue because I believe in standing up for the consumer. I will do several things. First of all, as I proposed, I want to block Reagan's proposal for deregulation of oil gas. I want to repeal the take-or-pay contracts, which is leading to this soaring cost of gas here in Iowa. I want to renegotiate the contracts with Canada and Algeria and so on that are sending up the price of gas. I have spent my whole life, Reuben, fighting for consumers. I have led an honorable and a decent public and private life. I have never permitted anything in my private affairs, including making a living, to interfere with the integrity of my position. I feel that very, very deeply, and I want you to understand, Reuben, there is utterly no doubt in my mind that I have served the public interest, the consumer's interest, and the interest of that average American, and that is the very reason that I'm in politics.
Senator. Thank you. Our next question is from Senator Hollings to Senator Cranston.
Alan, you come from a big agricultural state. We were out here a couple of weeks ago, and on the question of parity, I felt at that time that the sort of time ran out on you, and you did not have sufficient time to answer that question and explain your agricultural position in that of parity. What is it?
Well, parity means many things to many people. I support an agricultural policy that will achieve the goals of those who have one version or another of parity in their minds. What I support specifically is price supports that will guarantee the American farmer a return on the cost of their production, including the cost of soil conservation and including the cost of any loans they had to take out. The market is the best place to get that return, and we should create that economic climate. But if the market doesn't, then price support should do so. Why do we do that for farmers and not for everybody else? We do it for two reasons. Farmers face risks from weather and other elements that others do not. And secondly, we can get along without other commodities, but we cannot get along without food. That's why we have a need for that sort of a policy. We should look also to policies that will preserve the family farm and the farm communities. And looking beyond that, I envision a day when our farm policies will be devised not to reward farmers through commodities or cash or other inducements not to grow. We want them to be encouraged to grow all they can, because we are a nation, despite Ronald Reagan's apparent impression of the contrary, with many, many hungry people, children suffering from malnutrition, senior citizens suffering from malnutrition. We need to have enough food to meet their needs. And we live in a world where there are hundreds of millions of people on the brink of starvation. That's one of the fundamental causes of all the violence and turmoil and bloodshed and war in our world. And if we develop a policy where America's farmers can produce more, not less, and find ways to get that food to people who need it, America's farmers, with the great capacity they have to produce and the great soil they have to work with, can contribute mightily to justice in America and majestically to peace on earth.
Thank you, Senator Cranston. Now, Vice President Mondale, it's your turn to ask your question of Mr. Askew.
Mr. Askew, we have a tragedy in the Middle East now. We've got in Lebanon, we've got that horrible picture last night of American artillery landing on innocent civilians. There's no progress going on now. What should we be doing in Lebanon and in the Camp David Accords to make progress?
First of all, I think we ought to recognize that Lebanon is one phase of the whole Middle East problem. It can't be handled in a vacuum, and we need really to get back to the Camp David Accords. I think we need to phase the presence of the American Marines out as fast as possible, replacing it with the United Nations peacekeeping force. If ever there was a time, Fritz, the United Nations should work, it's right now to avoid any type of confrontations between superpowers, either directly or indirectly, and then to understand also that we're caught up in a civil war in Lebanon. I saw a study, I think, in 1977, where it said that there were 3 armies, 2 police forces, 17 militias, and 42 political parties. So what we've had is I think, as Senator Hollings said, we've had too few there if we're going to do something about it, and if we try to put more in, we would simply get in deeper. I would be working and pressing the United Nations and then withdrawing those troops as soon as possible, continuing to try to ensure that we don't have any further deterioration in relationship between Egypt and between Israel, a part that you constructively played in the Camp David Accords. I believe that the genius of the Camp David Accords was that we took incrementally what we could agree on, and then hopefully in agreeing, we created the atmosphere to agree further. But I think we've gotten away from them. Initially, I thought the President's initiative was consistent with it. I'm now convinced that it's inconsistent. We ought to get back to Camp David and recognize that in Lebanon is a civil war. We are perceived as taking one side of it. And our position there has been provocative. Our Marines there have been more of a target than a deterrent. If we think we're going to go back to the 1939 census and power sharing when there was a majority of Christians, that's not realistic. 3/4 of Lebanon is now Muslim, so we have to constructively play a diplomatic role and then ensure that whatever shelling that takes place is only in support of our own troops, in protection of them coming home, as well as the allies in the multinational peacekeeping force, and not try to expand it.
Thank you. Senator Hart. Senator Hart, you have a question for Reverend Jackson.
Reverend Jackson, your campaign and mine are a lot alike, and I suppose we both fall under that category of long shots that you suggested, although I think mine's getting to be a shorter shot than it was before. What did you think when you heard after you announced that the rules now prohibited you from winning this party's nomination? Our friend between us here has a campaign which is saying that none of us here has a chance of winning, regardless of what we do in the Iowa caucuses or New Hampshire primary, because of the rules. You think that is the situation, and how do you feel about it?
Well, you know, I think that when we structure in injustice and have 2 sets of rules, we also structure in a lot of anxiety and hostility and bitterness. There are 4 phases in this campaign. This is the exhibition season. And then when the caucuses begin, you have the regular season. In San Francisco, we have the playoffs. And then you have the Super Bowl between San Francisco and November. And you better be careful and not lock people out of the playoffs that you're going to need in the Super Bowl. That's wisdom. You understand? Yeah. In 1960, we won by the margin of hope and revived spirits, 112,000 votes, Kennedy to beat Nixon. In 68, we lost by the margin of despair, 550,000 votes. And so when you make the threshold so high until poor people can't reach it, that's dangerous, because American life is not a blanket of one piece of broken cloth and big labor and big business. America is more like a quilt of many small patches and pieces and colors and textures. and all of it fits somewhere and make up this democratic fabric. All of it fits somewhere. And so I hold fast to the one person, one vote provision so as to make everybody count. I mean, the peace activists, the environmentalists, the black, the Hispanic, the Asian, the American Indian, the women, these people must feel that they count somewhere. Now, I'm afraid that this long shot, big shot, aristocratic Democratic, where Labor commandeers the money and gives it to one candidate and knocks 7 of us off. I wish that Labor would have had a platform like this and not just a newspaper.
Thank you. Lane Kirkland is in town today, and if he cares to come down here afterwards and have his own forum, why, he's welcome to the place. It's already paid for. Senator Glenn, it's now your turn to ask a question of Mr. Hollings.
Yeah. Fritz, you know, for 3 years we've seen cutbacks in the area of civil rights. We have civil rights laws on the books that apply to all of our states. We expect businesses and organizations to live up to them. They apply to everywhere except on Capitol Hill, and we exempt ourselves from those in our own hiring practices on Capitol Hill. In fact, it's been called the last plantation. In 1978, I introduced a bill to close the last plantation and bring civil rights protection to women and minorities seeking employment in the United States Senate. You filibustered that bill to death. Have your views on this issue changed?
Well, Mr. Glenn, let me correct that record. I didn't introduce a bill. I introduced the first black to be a committee director in the United States Senate. It wasn't Teddy Kennedy. It wasn't John Glenn. It wasn't Jesse Jackson. It was Fritz Hollings of South Carolina with Ralph Everett, who's the first black there. As far as women is concerned, I didn't introduce the bill. I hired the first woman, Liz Tankersley, as a chairman, the director of the Senate Budget Committee at $52,000 a year. So you can run around palavering about you introducing bills. It's not what you say, it's what we do. See? That's right. Now, my director in these states are women. In fact, my field director, Miss Nancy George of Iowa, was president of the State Teachers Association out here in Iowa. And I have women in all of these capacities, and incidentally, they're not there just to be women. They're there because they do a job better than women or better than men, to tell you the truth. So you just all confused in that capsule of yours, and you hadn't really got down on the ground floor. The ground floor of public service. And what you'll find out when you get down on that ground floor is what a man will do in public office is best told by what a man has done. Performance is better than promise. And you look at the record of performance of 18 years where I've debated every foreign policy issue, every civil rights issue, opposing, if you please, in my own state against my senior senator, Strom Thurmond, the Bob Jones decision of this case, leading the way for voting rights, as they will tell you, Jesse, and they have, and moving on forward with the opportunities at everything, opposing the president, doing away with the Civil Rights Commission. These are my actions on what I've done.
Senator Cranston, you have a question for Senator Hart.
Gary, why did you vote for James Watt to be Secretary of Interior?
Well, it's a vote I regret, and clearly I would take back, but let me, as you suggested about the tax bill, let me explain. We all make mistakes, Alan. The Constitution provides that the president is entitled to appoint the people who he selects to carry out his policies. I don't think James Watt was the problem. I think Ronald Reagan's the problem, and that's one reason I'm running for president. I think we have to ask the appointees of presidents very tough questions, and that's why I sat all day in the Energy Committee so that I could ask James Watt questions. And I don't believe we have the privilege of just voting against people because we don't like the way they look or we may not agree with them. The fact of the matter is the president selected this individual to run that agency. We picked the wrong president.
Thank you. Reverend Jackson, you have a question for Mr. McGovern.
Mr. McGovern, I have raised continuously in this forum, and I have not been able to get a satisfactory response on this matter from the panel. The Voting Rights Act of '65 is not being enforced. The result is the progressive movement of this country is undercut. We lost a nuclear freeze vote by 6 votes. From Virginia around to Mississippi, 9 states where 53% of all blacks live, for example, there's only 1 black congressperson out of 115 18 years later. The result of second primaries and dual registration is that blacks, Hispanics, women, and poor people are undercut. We don't just need to aid women and blacks, we need to empower them. The Voting Rights Act has been undercut. What would you do as president to enforce the Voting Rights Act of '65 and the new forms of denial?
First of all, Jesse, let me thank you in your answer to Gary for explaining how important it is that we get to the Super Bowl. I wish you'd make that speech up in Iowa City and up in Decorah. I know you were at the Super Bowl because I sat right behind you. But I got into all kinds of trouble for going. You didn't. Now, and I want to thank you for taking me to Mississippi last summer to campaign through Mississippi, because we were given a good education on the Voting Rights Act. It is a fact that the double primary has the effect of making it almost impossible for a black person to win high office in that state and in some other parts of the South. The dual registration that requires people to register not only in their home precinct, but travel 75 or 80 miles to the county seat, that handicaps people who are poor, who don't have automobiles, and that ought to be ended. Now, those are state matters, but I think the President of the United States ought to order the Department of Justice to challenge those rules. I think we need more referees in some of the states to see that the Voting Rights Act is enforced. I could only tell you, without being as expert on this matter as I know you are, that I would consult with you and consult with others, and I would do everything within the power of the Department of Justice to see that not only the letter of the Voting Rights Act is enforced, but the spirit of that act. It's absolutely important, absolutely crucial that everybody is entitled to vote in this country. And as you say, if we begin electing people in the Deep South with a more progressive spirit, we'll win some of these close calls on crucial issues that relate to war and peace and relate to justice in our own country.
Senator McGovern, you get to wind up this period of questioning among the candidates by a final question to Senator Glenn.
John, 50 years ago, Franklin Roosevelt recognized the Soviet Union. Most people now think it was a right move. 12 years ago, Richard Nixon opened up relations with the biggest communist country, China, and got high praise for that. Hasn't the time come for us to have diplomatic relations with the little communist countries like Angola, Vietnam, Cuba? Why would it not make sense to recognize them, having made that judgment with the big communist countries?
Well, I think with regard to Angola, there's been indication recently they're asking the Cubans to leave, and I see no reason why we should not go ahead and recognize Angola, get diplomatic relations there. This would also take away some of the difficulty with what Reverend Jackson was talking about with regard to South Africa. It takes away their excuse they may have for being in Namibia, so it settles 2 problems at one time. As far as Cuba is concerned, I think with regard to Cuba that it's much to their advantage to stop some of the policies that they have around the world as Cuban surrogates. In Angola, Zaire at one time, Ethiopia, Somalia, South Yemen, what they're doing in the Central American area. They still have political repression there at home. I think as long as Castro is bent in the direction he is going right now, directly against our own interests, I would not want to see us recognized right now. But we do have contact with them. I'm hopeful that we can encourage them to change their own policies in Cuba, because I think it would be to their best advantage. And I think at that time, then we would consider going ahead and making a move toward normalizing relations with them. But as long as they are bent as much against our own interests now, I'd not want to see us go ahead and do that immediately.
Thank you, gentlemen. That completes our period of cross-examination. We are going to pause very briefly now for a short intermission, and we will return for questions from our panelists.
This break in the program scheduled at the request of the candidates. They spent roughly an hour and 20 minutes now in this debate so far. And now for the next hour or so, they'll be taking questions from the Washington bureau chief of the Des Moines Register and from 5 Iowans representing a cross-section of this state. Now back to the debate and its moderator, James Gannon.
We are ready now to resume the Iowa Democratic debate with questions from our panelists. We will begin with questions from James Risser, the Washington bureau chief of the Des Moines Register. Mr. Risser will have one question for each of the candidates. The answers are to be limited to 1 minute. The first question will be for Mr. Hollings. Mr. Risser, go ahead.
Mr. Hollings, of the candidates here who have served in Congress, which is most of them here, you have consistently received the lowest ratings from environmental groups for your voting on environmental issues. You've opposed a number of clean air measures, voted for synthetic fuel development opposed by environmentalists, and supported costly water projects that were alleged to be environmentally destructive. President Reagan is perceived as being anti-environment, but would you be any better?
Mr. Reiser, let me correct your record. Number one, in 1976, I won from the Wildlife Conservation Society the Legislator of the Year of the War for leading the way and actually enacting into law the Coastal Zone Management Act. I instituted the Oceans and Atmosphere Committee. We started the measurements, for example, of acid rain some 12 years ago. I won 7 years ago the Environmental Policy Law Center Award in my own state. I've led the way for a clean environment, and I don't accept the service of that particular question because I have now on with the acid rain problem with the Environmental Law Center suggested the jumbling of natural gas to be burned with the coal in the Ohio Industrial Valley, so we will immediately diminish, if you please. And I work with Jacques Cousteau, and the Ocean Policy Dumping Act is my act in order to clean up the ocean. So I'm proud of my environmental record.
The next question will be for Mr. McGovern.
Mr. McGovern, your farm program calls for large price support set at 90% of parity, which is potentially a very costly program and the kind of massive government involvement in agriculture that recent administrations seem to have been trying to get away from. Two questions. What could such a program cost? And as part of it, would you be willing to force farmers to practice soil conservation or lose their federal benefits?
On the question of cost, Mr. Reiser, it would not be as expensive as the PIC program of the Reagan administration. That $12 billion program plus another $23 billion in USDA operations made it the most expensive agricultural year for the government in history. So 90% parity for farmers with the understanding they would have to reduce production would not be as expensive as that program. With regard to soil conservation, I would not provide any federal farm program benefits of any kind to a farm that did not have an approved soil conservation plan. And that judgment should be made by the local soil conservation district, which is most familiar with the problems of the local area.
You would not let the federal government impose it?
I would not. The soil conservation plan would be one approved by the local soil conservation district, the people elected by the farmers themselves.
The next question will be for Senator Glenn.
Senator Glenn, you were reluctant to advocate pulling the Marines out of Beirut until the day that President Reagan announced that's what he would do. You have favored some weapon systems posed by your rivals, including the nerve gas. weapons. Don't these things tend to show a strong predisposition on your part to rely heavily on military force in the conduct of foreign policy, the kind of views for which the President has been criticized?
No, not at all, because, you know, I went through 2 wars. I know the horror of war firsthand. I've had to write more than my share of those next of kin letters back to the state, and I can tell you that the people that have been in active combat that I know are the ones who are most dedicated to peace in this world. I propose reductions in the MX, the Rapid Deployment Force, the Bradley Fighting Vehicle, the Division Air Defense Systems, to reduce all of those things back so we could save ourselves about $15 billion in those areas. We can't ignore defense. We can't just butcher it and say that we still can be safe in this world of ours. The nerve gas was a matter of safety for our own troops on that vote and a matter of not going through unilateral disarmament, because those nerve gas shells that have been in stock since 1957, many are unsafe and they're coming out of stock right now. And so we're unilaterally disarming, plus the new shells that would replace them on a one-for-one basis have the materials inside the shells separate, so they're safe if there's a leak. Right now we're afraid we'd kill our own people, and so that vote, which I know got a lot of attention, Mr. Mondale certainly put that one forth here in Iowa, and very much so. And if he is a vote against that, he is for unilateral disarmament and for less safety
Senator
for our
Glenn,
own troops.
Your time is up. The next question is for Senator Cranston.
Senator Cranston, you advocate a freeze on nuclear weapons. At the same time, you favor development of the B-1, a plane that some of its critics say would never reach its intended targets in the Soviet Union. Do you support the B-1 because it's built in your state, or is there some other way that you explain what might seem to be an inconsistency in your general pro-peace, anti-war stand and development of such a costly weapon system?
The B-52 bomber is obsolete. We can no longer depend upon it, and everyone here recognizes that who's been in the Senate. George McGovern does, Gary Hart does, and Fritz Mondale does. They support the stealth bomber as an alternative. I believe that the B-1 bomber is preferable because it is better from an arms control point of view. But we should look beyond that to the need to have negotiations with the Soviets that end this arms race, and I would announce on January 20th, were I to become president then, that we would no longer test or deploy nuclear weapons. I would then seek to meet with the Soviet leader to start the task of getting rid of these weapon systems before they destroy us. We have to banish them from the face of the earth. As to being made in California, the MX is primarily made in California. 5 of the 6 defense contracts are there, but I'm against the MX. And my action on January 20th of 1985, if I'm able to take it, would halt production, would halt deployment and testing of the B-1, and the freeze would stop production.
Thank you. The next question will be for Reverend Jackson.
Mr. Jackson, your civil rights organization in Chicago has received large contributions from Arab interests, and you have taken a number of controversial positions on Mideast matters, including establishment of a Palestinian homeland. Do these things indicate a strong pro-Arab tilt in your views about the Mideast, and would you change our traditional relationships with Israel?
Number one, I want to bring clarity that what is at stake here is not a legal matter, not my integrity, but an organizational judgment. The PUSH Foundation I have no affiliation with at all. I'm not on its board, its staff, have no relationship at all. It sends out its contribution appeals 3 or 4 times a year. I do not have access to who contributes to it. As for PUSH for Excellence, I served as chairman of its board, never its president, never its operating officer. Therefore, it is possible for monies to come to that organization that I would know nothing about. But I do support the proposition that we should not make of Arab peoples pariahs, that in our judgment, there must be a Middle East policy now that includes the broad-based American interest. We must not just relate to Israel adequately, but relate to other Arab nations properly, because as a superpower, we must reconcile our moral, economic, political, geopolitical, and military interests. And I would hope that we would see the genius of Camp David is that it, one, reduced arms toward Israel on the one hand, and open up trade routes for Israel on the other, which I think was the most profound contribution to Israel's peace and security of anything in the last 35 years.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Next question will be for Mr. Mondale.
Mr. Mondale, you took 18 days to decide what you thought about the invasion of Grenada. and you were slower than most of the other candidates in calling for a Marine withdrawal from Beirut. What evidence is there that you would be able to act decisively in a foreign policy crisis as president?
As a matter of fact, I issued a very strong statement the day following Grenada and the following day in St. Paul, and I was strong on that issue. Secondly, on Lebanon, not only did I take a position for nearly 2.5 years, consistently and persistently, I pressed this administration to solve the underlying political problems, to protect those Marines, to bring in third-party countries, to bring United Nations forces. I think my position on Lebanon will stand well. Finally, if I make just one point in the Middle East, I happen to know something about that region. I was involved in that Camp David Accords and the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, and I think my policy was sound.
Question for Senator Hart.
Senator Hart, you have endorsed the President's decision to remove the Marines from Beirut, but unlike at least some of the candidates here, you want to leave them on the ships rather than have them come home. What's the purpose? Aren't they nearly as vulnerable there, will be as vulnerable there as they have been in Beirut, subject to kamikaze attacks or some other kind of attack on their safety?
No, I don't know any expert in foreign policy or military policy that believes the Marines will be nearly as vulnerable on board ship as they are on land. I've said that the only purpose of having an American military force in that region at all, namely in the Eastern Mediterranean, is to further any diplomatic effort we can make to bring the responsible factions together and to establish a coalition government. If that military force does not serve that purpose, it shouldn't be there. Ships, planes, Marines, or anything else.
What's the test? How will we know when it's time to leave?
Well, unfortunately, that's a presidential judgment, and as I've said before, we have the wrong president in office. If he is not, through his Secretary of State or any emissary, fulfilling any positive mission or role in getting those factions together, then I think the military forces themselves ought to be withdrawn, and I certainly think we shouldn't be shelling from those ships.
Finally, a question for Mr. Askew.
Mr. Askew, you've raised the abortion issue here yourself today, and you're seeking the support of anti-abortion groups. Two questions. Why do you think Congress would do better than the Supreme Court on this issue, given its past paralysis on dealing with the abortion question? And number two, is it not inconsistent for you to oppose abortion and support the Equal Rights Amendment when so many of the anti-abortion groups have been active in the fight to defeat ERA?
No, in fact, I think one of the reasons that the ERA was defeated was that some chose to tie it into the abortion issue. I personally strongly support the Equal Rights Amendment. As far as abortion is concerned, obviously I disagree with many of the feminist organizations. I believe that we should amend the Constitution, reverse Roe v. Wade. I don't think the Constitution ever intended for a constitutional right to an abortion. And be that, you move it to the elective body. Why shouldn't Congress do it? Congress may not want that ball. The fact is, Congress should be the one to try to deal with the issues. Are you going to continue to try to litigate up to some 5 years every issue within the courts, or are you going to have it within the Congress? And depending upon who makes the next appointments, those supporting ERA may want essentially the same amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Risser. We will continue now with questions from a panel of Iowa citizens selected to represent various regions of the state and different elements of the Iowa electorate, including the business community, education, farming, minority groups, and women voters. The panelists each will pose one question, and these questions will be answered by all of the candidates before us today. Our first panelist is Larissa Sellers. Ms. Sellers, who has been active in Iowa feminist organizations, currently is a master's degree student in business at Drake University in Des Moines. Ms. Sellers will state her question, and the candidates will answer, beginning with Mr. Hollings.
Most of us were not raised to be feminists. Our sensitivity to the special situations of women and our commitment to equal opportunity for all have been shaped by our experiences and our perceptions. During this campaign, we've heard your positions on various issues with particular relevance to women. Please talk right now about your personal evolution as a feminist. Specifically, what experiences have shaped your thinking about women in our society?
Well, I think the first experience I had some years ago in contradiction to our colleagues here talking about the feminization of poverty, was to be led by Sister Anthony to the poverty sections in my own backyard, which caused me to travel not only my entire state but up into New York, which caused me to write a book and then co-author along with Hewitt Humphrey, Women's, Infants, and Children's Feeding. So I know that poverty has been feminized for the past 25 or 30 years. I've never seen abandoned children sitting around with a father. It's always an aunt, a grandmother, or someone of that kind. I know from my good friend Martha Griffiths, who's the Lieutenant Governor now of Michigan, the author of the Equal Rights Amendment, and an astute attorney, about all the disparities relative to women. And she knows of my strong stand for the ERA, for the Economic Equity Act, for the Women's Economic Education Act, and I am the original sponsor with Bob Packwood of the Fair Insurance Practices Act. I'm sorry my time is limited, but therein is how I started and why I feel that way.
Mr. McGovern?
I think the experience that most opened my eyes on the discrimination against women in our society was chairing the Democratic Commission on Delegate Selection and Party Structure. That was a commission that came out of the '68 convention and was designed to do something about opening up the presidential selection process to women, to young people, to blacks and Hispanics. We discovered something that, frankly, I was not fully aware of, that in many states, women comprise less than 10%, in some states as low as 5%, of the delegations picking the presidential nominee. I'm very pleased to say that in the course of those deliberations, we were able to develop guidelines that for the first time in 1972, and those guidelines have continued to prevail, we've insisted on equal access and equal representation for women in this most important of all political decisions, which is the selection of a presidential nominee.
Thank you. Senator Glenn.
I think probably what brought it home to me more than anything else, although this had been developing for a number of years in our concerns about the differences in pay and so on, the things that we talk about here in ERA, Economic Equity Act, and insurance differences that we address with legislation. But what it brought home to me was, as a senior Democrat on the Senate Special Committee on Aging, and looking into some of the problems of elderly women, and then coming back as to how those patterns developed in Social Security and insurance. There are some horrible stories there about women not being treated fairly in our society. And I think while it had been developing through the years as an awareness that I think 92% of AFDC payments go to women, 60-some% of the children that live in poverty in this country come from households headed by women. I think to answer your question specifically, it came home to me when I went on that Special Committee on Aging, started dealing with some of the problems, and then went back from the aged, back from the elderly to see how those patterns developed. Divorce, more households headed by women in our society, and we must deal with that because the problem is still getting worse. It's not getting better.
Thank you. Senator Cranston?
I learned about discrimination as a young foreign correspondent in Nazi Germany. I saw the Nazi stormtroopers take out, first of all, against communists, beat them up in the streets, kill them, put them in concentration camps. Then they went after homosexuals, and then Jews, and then Catholics, and then Protestants, and then Social Democrats, and pretty soon they were killing Czechs and Poles and French and Russians and Americans. And I learned then that if you permit discrimination against any individual based upon their membership in some class, then the rights of all are endangered. Secondly, when I was elected state controller in California in 1958, an office no Democrat had held for 72 years, I discovered that in the entire history of California, only 4 women had ever been appointed to any office by a state controller of California. Gross discrimination. I proceeded to break that barrier. I appointed more women than all the controllers in the history of California had appointed. I've done the same thing in the Senate, where I've had the opportunity to make appointments, and in my campaign. Finally, my light went out. Another point was ready to be made.
Reverend Jackson.
I grew up in a neighborhood where most of the heads of households were women. And so I grew up watching women assume responsibility. I watched most of those women go to work every day, and they were denied their access to pay based upon their investment in the work market. Most of my teachers were women, but at that time, by law, they could not make the same amount of money that white women could make, nor could they, for example, get the promotion that men could make. And I watched that process develop. I saw women, therefore, head households and be responsible. In my adult life, I have watched women develop a greater sense of consciousness about themselves and therefore make greater demands. I am convinced that the solution to equity now is to move from the pablum of liberalism toward women toward the parity of liberation. We must share power with women, not share platforms only. That's why in a party 50% female, a woman ought to split that ticket if they split those votes.
Thank you. Vice President Mondale.
I've been a product of all the influences that everyone's discussed, but I think the thing that has convinced me above all is to watch my wife Joan respond and grow and blossom as a result of the women's movement. She was in that generation with me where when we started our family it was sort of traditional and women were supposed to defer and so on. And over the years she's been a part of this national movement where she's staked out her own claims, her own profession, she's written her own book, she's developed her own skills, and she's become a very strong person in her own right.
Families, and neither had an opportunity to even finish high school. Both my parents worked all their lives, and I saw my own mother in the workplace being discriminated against in terms of the kind of income she could receive and kind of hours she had to work and so on. That stuck with me very deeply, I think, since I was a very young man. I went to work for George McGovern, as I had for Robert Kennedy, because I believed the Democratic Party and leaders like both them really represented equality and justice in this society, not only for minorities, but also for the majority gender. And it was in that experience in 1972, and Senator McGovern gets enormous credit for this, that I saw not only what our party had to do to break from the establishment stranglehold of the past, but how far we had to go even beyond that. And I think between that campaign and today, we have made great strides, but the men in this society have to do more than just offer equal rights as concessions. This is a fundamental proposition of justice.
Thank you. Mr. Askew?
Well, I guess since you asked it in a personal way, I guess I can respond.
Our marriage improved and it became stronger because it was something for both of us. And that's the lesson of equal rights for women. We're all going to do better off, and we're going to be a far better nation if we get this prejudice behind us and accept everyone as equals.
Thank you. Senator Hart.
I grew up in a household of parents who both came from very large families, and neither had an opportunity to even finish high school. Both my parents worked all their lives. And I saw my own mother in the workplace being discriminated against in terms of the kind of income she could receive and kind of hours she had to work and so on. That stuck with me very deeply, I think, since I was a very young man. I went to work for George McGovern, as I had for Robert Kennedy, because I believed the Democratic Party and leaders like both them really represented equality and justice in this society, not only for minorities, but also for the majority gender. And it was in that experience in 1972, and Senator McGovern gets enormous credit for this, that I saw not only what our party had to do to break from the establishment stranglehold of the past, but how far we had to go even beyond that. And I think between that campaign and today, we have made great strides, but the men in this society have to do more than just offer equal rights as concessions. This is a fundamental proposition of justice.
Thank you. Mr. Askew?
Well, I guess since you ask it in a personal way, I guess I can respond in a personal way. I've never had the problem. I grew up in a family where my mother and father were divorced when I was a small child. At 33, my mother had 6 children, and she had to scrap, and I saw her do it. I made up my mind that the day that I could ever work, she'd never work again, and she didn't. I saw her time after time after time have jobs where she was not given the tight pay that I thought she should have paid. Then also I was raised in the church, in the Christian Science Church, which is the only denomination founded by a woman. And so I was used to seeing leadership of women, and so it was a very natural thing for me to accept the leadership role that women can play without feeling defensive, about what they can do. And as governor, I appointed women to head up departments, and I think almost in an parallel fashion, and my staff in the governor's office, I think I can do the same thing as president, but I'm not doing it, say, just to be thanked or otherwise. I'm doing it because it's right. The future of this nation lies in its ability to be whom it should. Unless it takes the full latent advantage of all of its people, it's never going to be the America that we want it to be.
Thank you, Mr. Askew.
Thank you.
And thank you, Ms. Sellers. Our next questioner is James O. Friedman. Mr. Friedman is the president of the University of Iowa. We will begin the answers to the questions from Mr. Friedman's question. We'll begin the answers with Mr. McGovern this time.
Senator McGovern, a number of recent reports have concluded that the quality of American education is at risk. What do you believe is the proper role of the federal government in achieving educational excellence, and what specific programs would you recommend as president to strengthen our schools and colleges and universities?
I think the principal problem is a funding problem. We're simply not investing enough resources in education in this country today to address that problem. What I have proposed is that the federal government relieve the states of the burden they're now carrying for welfare. It's approximately $20 billion, with the understanding that that money would be diverted to elementary and secondary education. That still leaves the basic funding responsibility at the state and local level where it has always been, but it provides a formula under which the states can carry that burden, while at the same time providing uniform standards on public assistance at the federal level. In higher education, I think instead of cutting back on the student loan program, as the present administration has done, that loan program should be opened up to all students who want to pursue higher education, and you deal with the default problem by putting the collection in the hands of the Internal Revenue Service.
Senator Glenn.
There are a number of things we have to do to restore excellence to our educational system. One is get back to a core curriculum, higher expectation of our students, time spent in school, teacher excellence, in-service training centers of excellence that many states have used to good advantage. The federal, if we once establish that, then the federal government's role has been to see that every single person had the chance to get on that educational ladder. Title I, Chapter I, Head Start programs, to make sure the least advantaged have a chance to get on that ladder. At the other end, beyond high school, make sure that we have the opportunity for every young person to get a higher education. At the University of New Hampshire just a few days ago, I proposed a 3-part program where in return for public service, either at community or in a conservation corps or a citizen soldier GI Bill, every single young person could get that kind of an opportunity to get on and get a college education if they wanted. This nation has been one of expanding opportunity throughout our history. With this Reagan administration, those opportunities have been cut back, and we have to reverse that in education, almost more importantly than any other thing we do if we're going to be competitive in the long-term future.
Thank you. Senator Cranston.
More federal assistance monetarily is plainly needed. The property tax cannot be depended upon to produce more revenues for education. We need to use those revenues to pay all teachers more so that we can attract and retain the best possible educators. We need to reduce class size. We need to restore student loans decimated by Ronald Reagan. We need to do all we can in every way to involve parents and families in the educational process. We need to pursue excellence in the classroom by teacher centers, which I created and Ronald Reagan abolished, where teachers can trade notes on what works and what does not work. We need to have a foundation on excellence in education to pursue that goal. Finally, let me stress that we need not solely talk about, as some of these reports, science and training people for the corporate and business world. Let us not forget the humanities and the arts, ethics, philosophy, morals, history, language, so that we train young Americans in what it takes to preserve freedom and what life is all about.
Thank you. Reverend Jackson.
There's a dual dimension in this educational pursuit. One dimension is adequate opportunity, enough money to pay teachers, enough money for scholarships. No child in this society who wants to go to college, has a mind to learn, a will to work, ought be turned away just because of lack of money. It's such a much better investment in that child's mind. But with all of the talk, we'll talk about opportunity. There's a flip side that we don't talk about very much. It's a crisis in effort, too. Our children are watching 5 hours of TV a night, choosing entertainment over education, and that's a crisis. The same kind of energy spent on developing our motor skills athletically is not spent on developing our cognitive skills intellectually. It's the flip side of that. And unless parents assume they share the responsibility, teachers give homework, parents must have them home to do that work. Education is a partnership. The government cannot teach you against your will. So there must be a sense of a combination of opportunity and effort to really make education work.
Vice President Mondale.
First of all, the President must lead in providing financial help for elementary and secondary education, for higher education, for investment in research and science in our centers of excellence in research, in student assistance, special help for disadvantaged children, and I have a major, carefully calibrated program to bring that about. But there are two other elements of presidential leadership that are also crucial. One is the President ought to lead the nation in a renaissance of interest in education, because we will not accomplish what you want unless all Americans understand that that's important again. Parents, teachers, administrators, school boards, everybody. And the final thing is a president every day ought to give an example of respect for learning, an example of honoring people who use their heads, who read and remember history, and for whom learning is important. We don't have that today.
Senator Hart.
I couldn't help but think as Fritz was talking, I can't remember in 3 years anyone saying that Ronald Reagan has read a book. This country has to do more than just restore the programs that have been cut under this administration. We were going downhill in education as a nation even before Ronald Reagan. We have to go back to the programs of the 1960s and 70s that were working all the way from school lunch, linking nutrition to learning, up through Pell Grants and guaranteed student loans for middle and lower income students to go on to higher education. To go beyond that, I proposed 3 years ago an American Defense Education Act patterned after the National Defense Education Act of the 1950s. That is a major financial commitment to public education. But I also believe we have to have a president who educates the American people, that the process of learning goes on beyond the public school system. We need individual training accounts for our workers. We need an entire national system that is committed to keeping our greatest asset, the human mind, as keen as it can be.
Thank you. Mr. Askew, please.
I believe that we need a national recommitment to education. I think no less than the President of the United States can lead the charge. I think he has to use a moral persuasion of his office. On the federal level, I think the federal government's role should be one essentially of quality assurance, innovation, and assurances against discrimination, and to try to help particularly handicapped, exceptional children, but not be hesitant to become involved if it actually means a difference toward moving toward this national commitment. But ultimately, the funding, which becomes critically important, It's going to have to come largely from state and local levels. So unless this effort is made by a president, you're not going to get the public support. And if we don't upgrade teacher salaries, you're not going to get good teachers in it. And if they're not competitive, you're not going to keep them in it. So it's a matter really of understanding the relationship between the future of this nation as an informed citizenry, which we must have, and the relevance between job opportunity and education. It's no less. And if we do, we're going to have a strong America for our children and our children's children.
Thank you. Senator
I was talking a moment ago of women's, infants, and children's feeding. If you want quality in education, you must follow that on with a coast-to-coast daycare center system to give every child a head start and a full-time professional teacher to give them a quality finish. Specifically, teaching is not a profession, and the teachers are grossly underpaid. It's a question not of merit pay, but of base pay. So, number one, institute, if you please, a professional teacher commission at every one of the state levels, controlled by the state, made up of the higher education increment of teaching, the administrators, the board members, and at least half or perhaps a majority of classroom teachers to set their own professional standards. And once declared professionally competent, then pay them immediately $5,000 from the federal level. You'd say, how do you get that money? You just wanted to freeze. I'd say they've been underpaid for 100 years. I'd still go with the freeze, and thereafter I would reallocate from the B-1 bomber of $40 billion and the MX missile of $30 billion, the money for this particular program. The children of America are worth at least one weapon system.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman. Our third panelist is Martha Nash. She is director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Education and Vocational Training in Waterloo, Iowa. We will begin the answers to the question from Mrs. Nash with Senator Glenn.
You have covered it during this discussion at various times on certain facets of civil rights in that area. But as a black person living in Waterloo, Iowa, and as a director of the center, I am distressed and I am angered by the present administration's, as well as this nation's, going out of its way, to coin a phrase, to abjure a 20-year commitment to equal opportunity. If you are elected president, what will you do to see that the federal government, particularly the executive branch over which the president has direct control, will actively implement programs that will ensure a recommitment to equal opportunity in all areas of American life?
I think it's a tragedy that in this day of ours, 29 years after Brown versus Board of Education and 2 decades after the Civil Rights Acts were being passed, that we still find ourselves with an administration today that cut back in every single enforcement function of government. Every single one of them, right across the board. Now we should be trying to carry out the intent of those laws and get on with trying to live on this earth as God intended us to live, together, without regard to race or creed or color. And this administration is not doing that, and it's been evidenced by what they tried to do with the Equal Rights Commission and packing that. It's been evidenced in their cutback on minority appointments all across the whole government scale, from one end of the government to the other. It's not just a matter now of saying that we have those rights on the books so it's all taken care of. It's having presidential leadership that gets on with carrying out the intent of that law so we can be the first nation in history to ever get racism and bigotry behind us once and for all. And that would be my objective, to accomplish that.
Senator Cranston.
The first thing we have to do to advance the cause of blacks, women, and all others subjected to discrimination in our society is to defeat Ronald Reagan. The next president should see to it that we have a Civil Rights Commission that advances the cause of civil rights, doesn't try to kill it, as Ronald Reagan's commission has done. Then you need an Attorney General to enforce all the laws relating to civil rights and voting rights and against discrimination. Third, and this is terribly important in terms of the next presidency, there must be a president who will appoint to the Supreme Court, and there will probably be many appointments by the next president. God forbid it's Ronald Reagan. People who will understand the struggle for equality in our country and maintain the progress through the Supreme Court's rules. Fourth, or next, we need a president absolutely committed to full employment, because we need opportunities for blacks and all others for jobs, and until we create that opportunity, there will be inequality. Finally, we have to deal with the problems of the ghetto kids. That is the worst injustice in America.
Thank you. Reverend Jackson.
I suppose one of the most basic lessons to be learned in this nation is that every civil right law that has been passed is always applied to every other American citizen. So when the Public Accommodations Bill was passed, it covered everybody who would have been denied. The Voting Rights Act was passed. It protected Hispanics for the first time with bilingual provisions in there. It protected teenagers for the first time. The point is that this administration has radically cut back on equal protection under the law for a broad class of people. Women, 70% of all poor children live in a house headed by a woman where there is no man. If women are not enfranchised, they cannot protect those children. So women's civil rights are not being protected, and Hispanic civil rights, and Asian Americans, the disabled, and those who are poor. And I would hope that this time around that we would make certain that the civil rights thrust would be characterized not just by color, but by the rainbow of colors, and be characterized by the locked out. And if we have the base that broad, then not only can we not be pushed back, but we also can retire this repressive regime.
Thank you. Mr. Mondale.
Not far north of here, I grew up, and my dad was a minister, and my mom was a music teacher. And I was taught that to discriminate was a sin, and I believe it is. I think what we're talking about is not policy and differences over policy. We're talking about a radical assault on the right of children of God to be treated as equals in American society. And I'm not just disappointed, I'm mad that we hear from our White House that when a hungry child is hungry, it's a hustler, and that people in America are homeless because they like it that way. It's enough to suffer, but to be insulted by people in the highest office of this land when you need some help and some love is totally intolerable, and that's why Mr. Reagan must go.
Senator Hart.
Well, any administration that believes that people choose to sleep on outdoor grates and that there is no hunger is an administration fully capable of seeking to reverse 20 or 30 years of civil rights and civil justice in this society. This is an administration outside the mainstream of American life, and as Fritz Mondale has properly said, that alone should be the cause for its defeat. But it will not be defeated merely by us saying we're going to appoint people who are more committed to the Civil Rights Commission than others. We must have an open party. I applaud what Reverend Jackson is standing for and what he's trying to do to open up this party, to make its rules such that we can elect more black people, Hispanics and others, into public office. Second, we have to do more than promise jobs. We have to promise people the ability to create jobs. Black people, Hispanic people, and women ought to be owning and operating their own business. And finally, this party must stand for a foreign policy that absolutely reverses our present relationship in South Africa and which establishes our commitment abroad to be the same thing that we claim to stand for here at home.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Askew.
Civil rights has played a part in almost every election that I've ever had. I'm not sure because of some of my votes in the Florida legislature I could have gotten elected governor without the Voting Rights Act of 1965. One of the goals that I really said to myself when I ran for governor of Florida is that I wanted to appoint so many black people, so many minorities, that when I left office it wouldn't be news of their appointment that they were black or minorities. It would simply be that they were who they were. I think I would carry that same record into the White House. I would appoint an attorney general who was sensitive, and as well as to other offices, and I would have a civil rights commission that would really monitor the law. Because I was a governor for 8 years and have more chief executive experience than anyone's sitting up here, but I want to tell you, ultimately, no one likes to be monitored, but everybody needs to be monitored. I've fought for legal services for the poor because sometimes government needs to be sued, And so it's a matter of what you've done in the past. It says what you can do in the future. And I think I could have a fair policy that would treat people fairly, and I think that's essentially what they're really talking about.
Senator Hollings.
10 years before my distinguished governor friend was governor, I led the way for the peaceful integration of Clemson University and Harvey-Gantt, and would not have received the 4 times I've been elected to the United States Senate 99% of the black and minority vote had I not been leading and continue to lead in that direction. Number one on the program is women's, infants, and children's feeding is only meeting and reaching 1/3 eligible. I'd start with that little infant child to come in with a healthy body and mind and fulfill that program, put back the cuts. I would take the Title I for the disadvantaged, where it said to stay the course. 2 million of those little kids had to drop the course. I would have that daycare center cuts in the matter of the Head Start program reestablished. With the ghetto child, there's no question in my mind that that inner city teacher ought to receive $10,000. I don't want to renew buildings, I want to renew children there. And then, as Teddy Roosevelt said, the White House and the presidency is a bully pulpit to admonish, cajole, and persuade and lead. You got to stand for civil rights, you got to speak civil rights, and lead for civil rights as that symbol as President of the United States.
Thank you. Mr. McGovern?
The present administration has moved on 3 broad paths. First of all, it has granted a major tax reduction for the rich. Secondly, it has escalated military spending beyond anything we've ever known before. And thirdly, it has cut programs designed to improve the lives of poor people, of black people, of women, of children. All 3 of these things have damaged the position of black people and other minorities in this country. If you want to see in one sentence the net result of what has happened the last 3 years with these kinds of priorities, people who earn $10,000 a year or less, families with that kind of income, had $17 billion taken away from them. Those families earning $100,000 a year or more were given $55 billion in tax breaks. This is an indication of the collapse of moral values that I think goes to the heart of your question.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Thank you, Mrs. Nash. The next questioner is Matthew Buxbaum of Des Moines. Mr. Buxbaum is president of General Growth Companies, a real estate development concern. The responses to his question will begin with Mr. Cranston.
Senator Cranston, if you are in business today, you're getting a lot of mixed signals. In the past, high interest rates were blamed on the high rate of inflation. And now that inflation has subsided and interest rates are still high, the high rates are attributed to the large budget deficits. Common sense tells us that there are 2 ways to reduce the deficit: raise taxes or reduce spending. This gives us nothing but painful choices. If you were elected president, would you be willing to recommend or endorse the following tax changes? 1, raise personal income taxes. 2, increase capital gains tax rates. And 3, institute a national sales tax.
No. I favor raising income taxes once again on those in the higher brackets who are not now paying their fair share. And they aren't after the Reagan-Kemp-Roth tax cuts. But I would not raise them on other people. 2, I would not raise capital gains. I think capital gains should be low to encourage investment in new jobs and new productivity, new opportunities in our country. 3, I would not favor a national sales tax because that is regressive. It is not fair to people in the lowest income brackets. It makes no impact on the people in the higher income brackets. What I would do to deal with the problem that causes you to ask the question is move toward a balanced budget to get interest rates down, change Federal Reserve Board policy to get interest rates down, and deal with the productivity and production problems of our country to achieve full employment. How do you balance the budget? 1, restore taxes, as I said. 2, get interest rates down so you can knock $50 billion off the deficit. 3, get people back to work so they're paying taxes and not needing assistance. And 4, get the arms race off our backs.
Reverend Jackson.
First of all, I believe we need a strong industrial base. But I think corporations must pay their share of the taxes. To whom more is given, more is required. If Mr. Reagan's tax break meant that corporations would get this additional incentive and then accept the obligation to reinvest in this economy, reindustrialize this economy, and retrain our workforce and do creative things like put daycare centers at the jobs where parents can come to work and have that kind of creative thrust, that would have been a good idea. But corporations have not paid their share of taxes. They've used their high-priced lawyers to jump into loopholes. The only reason a major corporation pays taxes now, it needs to file its accountant. Corporations are not pulling their share, in my judgment. I think further that if corporations begin to strengthen our economy, we can then compete with the world economy, not have to run out the back door in content legislation. I will never be satisfied until we address in a major way corporate responsibility, because I said this lastly, I cannot be satisfied just with having a job and a foreign boss. Full employment is not enough. We had that in slavery. Everybody had a job, but we had no self-respect. Corporations must assume their share of responsibility.
Thank you. Mr. Mondale.
Does that applause come out of my time? Of course it does. There is no question but that small business and entrepreneurship is crucial to our future. We must get those deficits down and get them down dramatically to get real interest rates down. That's the best thing you can do for business and create a healthy economic climate. That's why I propose reducing Reagan's deficit by more than 50%, by cutting spending by $70 billion, and restoring revenue by $60 billion. Everybody's going to restore revenue or raise taxes, whether they admit it or not. Reagan's waiting until after the election to tell what his plan is, because he plans to stick it to the same middle and moderate income Americans that got the business in the '81 tax bill, and not restore revenues from the very wealthy, from those who get tremendous tax preferences, to some 90,000 profitable corporations that don't pay a dime in taxes. My revenue would be restored in that way. We also need to look at the tax package to make certain it helps investment. And I would repeal the capital gains tax for certain kinds of small business investments and make the R&D tax credit permanent.
Thank you. Senator Hart.
I do not support any of the three initiatives that you suggested, but I do support the following things. And by the way, let me just say, I not only voted against Kemp Roth 12 times, I voted against it the 13th time when it counted, because I felt that I felt that was a very uneven and very unjust tax cut, and it was. We can raise revenues one of two ways: by increasing the taxes on those who are already working, or by putting people back to work and broadening the tax base. A long-term jobs program dedicated to reemployment over a long term of the structurally unemployed will raise more revenues than anything else we can do, certainly more than just increasing incrementally the taxes of working people. But second, we have to have incentives for people to invest their money and form capital for businesses like yours. I proposed some time ago something called a new capacity stock, which would give people a tax break for saving their money and putting it into stock in young and new businesses, so that people such as you would have the capital necessary to expand.
Mr. Askey.
I do not believe that we're going to get a handle on the deficits except a fair combination of tax increases and spending cuts. It just won't happen any other way, and it's going to require credibility to moderate defense spending and then be able to look at the whole broad area of entitlements, except those affecting the poor. In response to your question of the personal income tax, yes, I would look at some adjustments on the personal income tax, because I think we went far too far during the Kemp-Roth in adjusting those income tax brackets. Increased capital gains, I would oppose that, except that I would also support actually reducing or exempting certain small businesses. The national sales tax, I would not support that, because I think that that would be even more regressive. But we do know that a value-added tax, which is something like that, could help us on an import-export basis, might be something to look at, but it would present a lot of problems in being essentially a national sales tax.
Thank you. Senator Hollings.
First, let me correct the record with respect to my friend Gary Hart, because I've told him about this before. When Reaganomics passed the $750 billion package, when it counted on August the 3rd, that's the conference report, there were two votes, one a motion to recommit by Senator Kennedy, and then, of course, the passage of the conference report. Senator Hart was not present and did not vote. That's when it counted. Now, with respect to your taxes, I oppose all three of them. I have it right here. I oppose all three of them. And what you need to do is first freeze those entitlements, freeze defense spending, and then oppose every one of your particular tax increases and go to the indexing that Senator Hart voted for as a part of Reaganomics, abolish that, and go to the corporate tax itself. They say in New York, if you paid any taxes as a business last year, you better fire your accountant. We need a minimum corporate tax and not the discriminatory taxes against the individuals to abolish the middle class as you recommend.
Mr. McGovern.
Dr. Martin Feldstein, President Reagan's top economic advisor, says that the deficit is a time bomb that's going to go off after the election. He also says the two causes of it are a bad tax law and excessive, wasteful military spending. I agree with Dr. Feldstein. He's probably going to get fired for what he says because the president doesn't agree with him. But I see no way to bring down this deficit other than the two ways that Feldstein has suggested. Number one, straightening out that tax law. I would recommend closing off a lot of the write-offs and loopholes right at the top of the income scale, a situation that permitted General Electric 2 years ago to earn $1.6 billion and not pay a dime in federal taxes. It's not fair. And the other thing we have to do is to cut about 20 or 25% out of all the boondoggling and waste in the Pentagon, and we can balance that budget.
Yeah. Thank you. Finally, Senator Glenn.
I wish we had more than just 1 minute to answer this because we've gotten around finally to an area where we really do have some differences. I have done what you have proposed here. I've said we cut budgets where we can. We want a pay-as-you-go system. We put an across-the-board surcharge on devoted solely to deficit reduction. We defer indexing. Those things will gain us some $80 billion by 1988. Mr. Mondale has criticized me for this tax proposal, claiming it would cost people $900 a year. That's not true. I would point out some differences between our bases. I base my tax proposals on what they will do and cutting the deficit back by half by the end of the first term on the Congressional Budget Office figures. Mr. Mondale, to make the rosy scenario projection that he makes, use the administration's figures of projections of inflation and unemployment and gross national product. We all can balance the budget if we follow Reagan's lead in this thing.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Buxbaum. Our final panelist is Denise O'Brien. Denise O'Brien and her husband operate a diversified farm near Atlantic, Iowa, where they raise pigs, dairy cows, beef cattle, grain crops, fresh fruit, and 3 small children. Responses to the question from Denise O'Brien will begin with Reverend Jackson.
First of all, I'd like to suggest that as a citizen, I'd like to suggest to you 8 candidates here that you all go to Russia to the funeral. I think that would be a good thing to do. Anyway. As a farmer, the guidelines for establishing my Social Security income are discriminating and archaic. I have been paying into the Social Security system on an equal basis with my husband, yet my income will probably be less than a homemaker who has not contributed. In this instance, Social Security favors those who pay in less or nothing at all. However, if I had not contributed to Social Security, I would not be eligible for disability and certain other benefits. How would you, as President, Reverend Jackson, correct these inequities in contributions and benefits to farm women?
Well, I think that it is a basic issue of women generally being protected and appreciating the fact that even when women are out of the traditional labor market raising families, that they are in fact making a contribution. In the range of adjustments that must be made to provide women equal protection under the law, that must be a major consideration. I would hope that that would just be a basic commitment by all of us, and I think all of us basically do, to a floor in the democracy that would spare women in their agony that is based solely upon their sex. And furthermore, a commitment to protect women, infants, children, and poor people. I think that's the fundamental moral challenge that we have today, not only to cut a budget or freeze a budget, but use it in such a way that women such as yourself do not feel the pain and the anxiety of being female or being rural or being poor.
Thank you. Mr. Mondale?
This issue cuts clear across women everywhere. And that's why the Congress in the Social Security Committee report directed the administration to come up with a recommendation and a study on the unfairness of earnings sharing as it applies to women. You've given a good example. This same thing occurs in pensions, it occurs in insurance, and that's the reason why most people in poverty are women. And by the end of this century, if we keep Reagan and his type around, they'll all be women and children. They did other things. They repealed the minimum payment for Social Security. That is always women who are the poorest. They're the ones that got singled out. They repealed the payments for the dependents, usually of widows going on to college. They repealed that. Wherever women were found and their rights under Social Security were found, this president, Mr. Reagan, and Mr. Stockman and the rest, with their flinty-eyed approach, went after women. This is a good reason why all women ought to throw them out and get a good president there.
All right. Senator Hart.
Great American named Martha Keyes was a congresswoman from Kansas for 2 terms and served on the House Ways and Means Committee and also on the Reform Commission on the Social Security laws. She just happens to be my sister-in-law as well. Recommended very strongly the earnings sharing, income sharing proposal, which Vice President Mondale has mentioned. It's a proposal I strongly support. It is directly addressed or directly designed to address the very inequitable situation in the Social Security laws that you've mentioned. They are most profound among farm women, no question about it, and your experience, I think, is typical of many, too many. But they are also shared throughout the working economy. There has to be a situation in which the wife and the husband can commingle their income so that the wife, who is systematically discriminated against until we get pay equity, can receive the same or qualify for the same amount of benefits that her husband does upon retirement. And I think we have to adopt that as a basic reform in the Social Security laws.
Mr. Askew.
Well, it's a good case, first of all, for the ratification, passage and ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. Second, when you're looking at just this problem, I don't think it can be separated from all the others that the others have attempted to address. But I believe that until we seek to find ways in which we can have fairness in terms of a sharing of income, because ultimately that's what this is what it's all about, is a sharing of income, will you ever really have equity? And I hearken back to the question of the lady in regard to women. I grew up and saw this firsthand, and I certainly would commit to you to do what I could in this regard. The only thing I would want to caution you on is that every time we make a change in Social Security, we compound the problem on the deficit. So I think you have to be careful as we talk about the deficits to ensure that we don't create unrealistic expectations. But from the standpoint of the issue is genuine, and I'm committed to try to help.
Thank you. Senator Hollins.
Some 35 years ago as a trial lawyer, I had just that task to prove the worth of a housewife, a farmer's wife. They said she wasn't worth anything. She was killed in an accident and there was no loss. And I started back thinking of these things some 35 years ago, and as a result, I am a co-sponsor of the Economic Equity Act, the Fair Insurance Practices Act, and the other measures that we've been talking about to correct the situation that you speak of. I think this is definitely one of the things that we must move on, and I'm pressing as best I can.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern.
I think we all know why you asked the question with the urgency that you did, because there's no group in our whole society that works any harder than farm women, and no group more discriminated against. We talk a lot about the discrimination against working women, and usually we use that term working to apply only to those who work outside of the home, but there's a lot of hard work done in the home and on the farm that requires all of the intelligence and all of the energy that anyone can muster. And yet those are the areas where the Social Security program, the pensions, the IRA accounts, and other things work discrimination. I think every man on this platform has been sensitized to those problems. One thing that I say with complete confidence, the women of this country are going to be better off in the presidency with one of the men on this platform than with the man who holds that job now.
Senator Glenn.
These problems really start in the working years, of course, where women only earn about 62 cents on the dollar for what men earn. Those women that are out in the workplace, not the specific situation that you talked about. And it's the reason why I'm a co-sponsor. I've been a sponsor of the ERA and the Economic Equity Act. I don't think anyone up here would disagrees with that. Everyone is sponsoring that. But it goes beyond that in the earnings sharing area that we have to specifically address. And that's one that whichever one of the partners is employed, the other would share that earnings under Social Security. And I think that's very important to address the problem that you suggest. I'm on the Senate Special Committee on Aging. We've had hearings on this very subject on how elderly women are being dealt with very, very unfairly. And it was as a result of those hearings I became a sponsor and advocate and have gone out given speeches on this, and I think that's one of the things we have to correct very soon. Thank you.
Senator Cranston.
The reason Congress passed a provision in the Social Security Reform Act that ordered a study of the unfair treatment of women under Social Security is that I offered an amendment to the Social Security bill when it was before the Senate, and that was adopted. That starts a study that will lead to a recommendation to solve the problem you pose, and we will then solve it. I took that action because representatives of the National Organization of Women and of the National Women's Political Caucus and my own wife, Norma, pointed out this unfairness and said, do something about it. And so I did. Plainly, we have to go beyond ERA, the Women's Equity Act, equity under insurance, and all these other provisions. Our vision must be an America where there is no more discrimination against anyone, where it finally gets through to all the American people that discrimination against anyone is a threat to all. Ask not for whom the bell tolls for thee. And that requires a president who will speak inspirationally and lead the nation in that direction.
Thank you. And thank you, Ms. O'Brien. That completes our panel discussion. It's time now for the closing statements by the candidates. The order has been determined by a lot, and we will begin with Mr. Mondale.
I began this discussion by saying that on February 20th, the Democrats of Iowa would be the most powerful citizens on earth. And that you will be if you'll use that power. In Iowa, politics is open. Everybody's invited in. You don't push very well, you'll do what you want to do. If there was ever a time that your country needed you, it's this time. As I've often said, this administration is neither moderate nor conservative on most issues, but in fact radical. They have radically departed from 40 years of bipartisan commitment to arms control, and we have a much more dangerous world. They've radically went away from the concept that you have to have a responsible budget, and we've got a deficit that is the highest in the history of civilization with all the problems. They've radically departed from a commitment to train this next generation to prepare it for our future. And in the area of fairness, whether it's civil rights or equal rights or the problems of Social Security or fair taxes, name it, this administration has been on the side of icy indifference. For all of those reasons, you must help your nation speak clearly for a change and for a Democrat who will make a difference. I'm committed for changing every one of those courses. The final point, which we've not discussed tonight, is that if Mr. Reagan is reelected, he will select the nominees to the Supreme Court when these great judges resign. And that could well be the end of the rest of justice in America. That court for 40 years has defended us. Often we haven't given them credit. It has been a remarkable institution for liberty and justice. Do not let Mr. Reagan get his hands on that court.
Thank you, Mr. Mondale. Next will be Senator Hart.
We used to have Democratic presidents who asked us what we could do for our country. And now we have candidates who promise everybody everything. We used to have candidates who challenged us to express our idealism. And now we have candidates who ask only our price. I think this country can do better than that. I am not willing to turn this country back one more time to the Reagans and Weinbergers and Wicks, nor am I satisfied to let our party move backward to an older establishment that seeks only to protect its previous gains and refuses to move this country forward. We are at a critical time in this nation's history. This is an election about our future versus our past. You are being told that a decision has been made by the party establishment in Washington, by the pundits, by the party establishment that has controlled this party, that you have only one choice in Iowa, and that is to ratify their decision. I believe the people of Iowa and of New Hampshire have the power to change the course of American history. I am running, and I need your help to move this country into the future. This is not a campaign for one candidate. This is a campaign and a cause for this nation. I ask for your help. I ask you to help me move this nation forward, to leave the past behind, to join the Roosevelts, the Trumans, and the Kennedys, who were willing to be experimental, who were willing to challenge the best instincts of the American people, who were willing to create, as we must create in the 1980s, a truly new democracy. Thank you very much.
Senator Glenn.
Our main goal must be to get Ronald Reagan out of the White House, change the policy so we can get this nation going again, as Gary said. But to listen to the TV ad that says, "I am ready," is not enough. Is the United States ready? Is the Democratic Party ready to listen to special interest leaders, the kingmakers, the bosses, the power brokers, who would anoint a nominee and say, "We have now spoken, and so you don't need to really think for yourself from there on"? And huge new spending proposed that is going to drive up interest rates beyond anything now, create more unemployment. The front page of the Des Moines Register has it on here about Mr. Mondale moves to counter criticism of his promises. The Wall Street Journal says at least $45 billion, maybe 90. We calculate it somewhere around 170 billion conservatively. I think we're going to have to, he's going to break the bank or break the promises if we go for that kind of leadership. I think we need a leadership that stands before the American people and says what they're going to do in the open, not another story behind closed doors, which we have a number of examples of, and I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to bring that up this evening. We must get Reagan and his policies out of the White House. But whom we elect to replace that man has to have the trust and confidence of the American people, and it has to be on matters spoken in public and in private. Private promises and public statements for the American people being the same. And it has to be for all our people, not just the few and the powerful. This is not just of and for, but it's by the people of this country. And it has to care for those who are the least advantaged. And we have to have the sensible center, not going just from pendulum swings of political feeling from the far right to the far left. And in the future, our goals must be set with the idea that this country is still fully capable of out-invent, out-research, out-compete anybody on the face of this earth. You start it all here just 9 days from now with your independent thinking. You're not on a leash. Big organizations come in and tell you it's all over. I don't buy that at all. You're independent people here. You're thinking for yourselves. Iowa is not for sale. Together we can change the future. Let's start it right here.
Senator Cranston.
Under Ronald Reagan, America's vision of a world of peace and freedom is being blasted by the guns of the U.S. Navy off the coast of Lebanon, by the guns of the U.S. paratroopers in Grenada, and by the guns of U.S. helicopters in Honduras and El Salvador. Under Reagan, America's vision of prosperity and progress at home is being blasted by government-induced bankruptcies, foreclosures, and unemployment, by government-sponsored ravaging of our environment, and by government indifference, not benign indifference, but malignant indifference toward women and minorities, the poor, the handicapped, children, elderly. I believe America deserves leadership that will make us respected around the world, not feared and not hated. Fear and hatred is bad for America now. Think what he'll be like if he wins in November. Think what he'll be like if he thinks he has a new mandate. Think what he'll be like when he never has to worry about facing the voters of America again. The restraints of moderation would be loosened. The reins would be off Reagan. A Reagan reelected would be a dangerous man. Reagan must be stopped. Under Ronald Reagan, America's vision of a world of peace and freedom is being blasted by the guns of the U.S. Navy off the coast of Lebanon, by the guns of the U.S. paratroopers in Grenada, and by the guns of U.S. helicopters in Honduras and El Salvador. Under Reagan, America's vision of prosperity and progress at home is being blasted by government-induced bankruptcies, foreclosures, and unemployment, by government-sponsored ravaging of our environment, and by government indifference, not benign indifference, but malignant indifference toward women and minorities, the poor, the handicapped, children, elderly. I believe America deserves leadership that will make us respected around the world, not feared and not hated. Fear and hatred are the legacy of Ronald Reagan. Peace and jobs, the very antithesis of the Reagan legacy of unemployment and warfare, are the very essence of the Democratic Party. It is our vision of the future for America. It is my vision for America. It is the way we beat Ronald Reagan.
Thank you. Senator Hollings.
Well, I agree with John. I don't know who's going to pay for the promises of Fritz Mondale, but I don't know who's going to pay for the inexperience of John Glenn. You know, the great frustration of America today is how do we keep from swinging from one extreme to the other, from no defense to nothing but defense, from programs and revenues to now no programs, no revenues, and $250 billion deficits. Before long, we won't have an economy to defend, and our children will just be wrecked. They won't be able to afford a home or send their children to college, and there's a way. It's not painless. There's got to be sacrifice, but if you just take that budget we passed in November and extend it for 1 year, then everyone in a shared sacrificial way will have to give. We can save $100 billion just for that 1 year, and then with 3% growth thereafter, be able to not only save $600 billion, but pay for the feeding and the daycare and the Head Start and educational programs that we believe in. You say, well, in defense, you've heard this before, but I have led the way for the consensus, over-prepared for nuclear, under-prepared for conventional. I put that in over the years of my experience. That's the point. You say, you've heard this before about a strong economy and strong defense, but I would admonish that Governor Carter, Governor Reagan didn't have the 18 years serving and debating every foreign policy issue and voting on it, serving as the chairman of the Budget Committee, and realizing that this country is not going to the dogs. It's not. What's really occurred is we just won't lead for sacrifice from the Washington level. But if you give me the chance, I'll lead for that sacrifice so we can have a government, we can have a program, we can have a future for America together. Sacrificing together, working together, pulling together, there's no force on earth that can stop us.
Mr. McGovern.
I've encountered 3 different kinds of voters here in Iowa over the last few months. One group are the kind of people who agree with me on the issues on which I've taken a stand, and I would say to them simply, thanks a lot and congratulations on your superior wisdom. There's another group of voters who tell me that they disagree with me on one or more of the positions I've taken, and that they can't vote for me on grounds of conscience. And to those people, I'll pray that their understanding will be enlarged. But there's a third group of voters that I've encountered all over this state who tell me they agree with what I've said, that they think I'm right on the issues, but they're not going to vote for me because in their view I can't be nominated, and they don't want to throw away their votes, as they put it. Now that's the group that I want to talk to for just a moment. Let's assume that that judgment is right, that somebody else has this nomination locked up. We'll just say, for purposes of discussion, it's Fritz over here, that he has it nominated. If that's true and he wins, he knows I'm going to be out campaigning for him. I don't think he's got it locked up. But let me say this. If you really believe that I'm the closest to your views on the issues before this country, you owe me that vote for this reason. It's the only way you're going to be able to send a message to whoever you think is the nominee of the direction in which you want that man to move. If you want military spending cut, rather than increased, and you're convinced I can't be the nominee, vote for me anyway, and the bigger that McGovern vote is, the more this eventual nominee is going to move in the direction that you think we ought to go. Don't throw away your conscience.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Thank you. Reverend Jackson.
We've heard the crisis stated from several angles today. The question is, what man or what men have the qualities of leadership to revive and redeem and reconcile the people? I have confronted corporations and governments and foreign leaders. Leaders must take charge and risk and make things happen. Whether it's Cuba or Nicaragua, Lebanon, the Soviet Union, or Syria, leaders cannot wait until after the fact and follow opinion polls. Leaders must mold opinion. They must inspire the youth. 28 million young people between ages 18 and 24 eligible, 17 million unregistered. They are the difference. Leaders must motivate the party, not monopolize it. We must speak to the third world, where 3/4 of the people on earth exist. Leadership must be believable. It must reconcile the rural farmer and the urban consumer. The Rainbow Coalition is a way out for the locked out. We're reaching back to those who've been forgotten and rejected and despised. We must restore confidence in our national leadership. We as a nation have the capacity to destroy the world, but we also are so civilized and so moral ultimately that we will choose another way. We will choose to feed and clothe and heal. We will choose to freeze the weapons and not burn the people and freeze the planet. We must choose a more excellent way. I'm standing here today as a member of this body of distinguished leaders. I've come from further back than any of them have come from. I intend to go further. I represent for this party and for this nation a chance and a choice. I'm not looking for a voter. I'm looking for a partner. Together we can make a difference.
Thank you. Mr. Askew.
President Reagan says America's back. I say America never went away. The strength and the spirit of the American people have been there all along, here in Iowa and across the land. We Americans are still capable of achieving our highest hopes and our fondest dreams, but we need real leadership to do it. We need a leader who sees the world as it is and not as it used to be. We need a leader who looks to the future and not to the past. We need a leader who's willing to be candid about the challenges we face and the sacrifices we must make. We need a leader who is fair, but who doesn't make promises that can't be kept. Above all, we need a leader who's willing to risk losing some votes as a candidate so that he'll be free to govern as a president. Unlike President Reagan and unlike my Democratic opponents, I believe I'm offering real leadership to America to deal realistically with the real world. With such leadership and with your help, we can prove to ourselves and to all the world that America is here to stay.
Thank you. To the candidates and to the panelists and to the audience, I'd like to express my appreciation for your participation today in this Iowa debate. A week from next Monday, Iowans will begin the national process of passing judgments on these candidates and on their ideas. By being here, gentlemen, you have given us a much sounder basis on which to make that judgment. And on behalf of the people of Iowa, I want to thank you. The Des Moines Register. The Des Moines Register has been pleased to sponsor this debate. And now from the Civic Center in Des Moines, this is James P. Gannon wishing you good evening.